Justice, she don't even live here no more. Standing in her place is a corrupted whore. Justice, she don't even live here no more. Standing in her place. Justice, she don't even live here no more. Standing in her place is a corrupted whore. Driven away by the machines of man.
Greetings! Welcome back to Disenthrall. I'm Patrick Smith. Today we have special guest Matt Sands with us. Welcome to the show, Matt Sands.
Thank you, Patrick.
Matt is a alumni, I guess you could say, of being on the show. He is an advocate for what he calls Nations of Sanity, a would-be movement that is built on the assertion that the only way to both define and create a free society, voluntarism, is to establish the NAP as the law through a peace agreement. Specifically, he presents a three-part peace agreement which covers the required dimensions for making this the law in the real world. So that is Matt Sands. We've had you on the show once before, and it was a really cool discussion. We got really nerdy, and we really... and this is his band, by the way, his reggae band that we played in there. So maybe you can give us some links that we can throw in the description for people that want to follow. But we had like a really nerdy discussion on the NAP, and we, tried to establish the NAP or from first principles, and we kind of talked through what might and might not be valid ways of like logically beginning and then working our way up to the NAP as an objective law that could be applied to everyone. And so I think it was a pretty long discussion actually we had on YouTube. And I enjoyed it.
About 4 hours, 5 hours?
No, this was the one on YouTube. I don't think it was that long.
Oh, sorry. No, that was only an hour. Yeah, sorry.
But other people also enjoyed this this discussion in our comments. I think a lot of our viewers that are still around today paying attention to the channel. In fact, some of our supporters, I think that might have been one of the first videos they saw on the channel. So they will recognize you in this discussion. Then we had a follow-up discussion on our Discord server. We have a lot of amazing discussions on our Discord server. This was certainly one of them. You joined us, and I think we talked for 5 hours straight or something like that on Discord. And then I think even after I left, the discussion continued on for a while longer. And then I think I came back after you had left, and people were still talking, and we continued talking or something like that. It was interesting. So we always have good talks when you're with us. So yeah, welcome back. Welcome back. Today, I think...
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
Yeah, man. So I think today, specifically, the topic that we wanted to begin with, although we are certainly free agents that will roam all over the world if we so choose, will be voluntary communes, was something that you wanted to discuss with me. So...
Oh, not communes, collectives.
Sorry. Well, I mean, what's the difference? Why don't I just hand the floor to you? Yeah, I'll hand the floor to you, and why don't you set us up and we'll go.
Yeah. Not communes. No, I mean, really, it's just about, because like this whole idea of making the non-aggression principle the law to create a free society. And sometimes when I present this to people, like they'll ask about, well, what happens with government and stuff like that? And one of the things I try to do is I try to separate from them, because a lot of people seem to think that if you don't have government, then you can't have any of the things that you associate with government. The good things, I mean, not the coercion and the violence, but like, the services, the infrastructure, all of that sort of stuff. So this is where I present the idea of voluntary. Well, that's, sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead. I was getting a link for the people in Discord.
Okay. So this is basically where I present the concept of voluntary collectives. So I basically say, look, okay, in a free society, which, as I say, I assert would involve having the non-aggression principle be the law established through a peace agreement, in relation, ruling governments would obviously be illegal. But you can still have voluntary collectives, which is kind of like government, but without the coercion, and government without the power to rule. So not government, basically, but when people sort of talk about having the sort of infrastructure they associate with government, then we need another word for it. And voluntary collective is kind of what I came up with. And it's part not just coming up with a name for it, but also sort of putting forward the idea to people to really remind them that they don't have to abandon everything that they currently want and associate with government. They can still have those things. They just don't get to do it by threatening people and ruling people and basically violating the non-aggression principle. If the NAP was the law, then everybody's self-ownership would be recognised and protected under that law, which means no one would have the power to rule over anybody. But we can still have this voluntary setup where people, associate on a voluntary basis.
So, I mean, that just sounds like a free society.
Well, yeah, but what I'm talking about is like a lot of people, when they present a free society, like particularly ANCAPs, they always talk about, basically the market, the free market, and people associate the market kind of traditional business competition and all of that sort of stuff. Some people, for example, just to give you an example of where I'm coming from, like here in England, we have a National Health Service. And obviously, when I present this idea, a lot of people talk about that as a first thing. They say, well, we want a National Health Service. And I'm like, well, you can have one. You don't have to say goodbye to the services. You just don't get to rob people who don't want to have any part of such a thing to fund such a thing. So it's all part and parcel of what a free society would entail. But it's just basically really pointing out that fact. I think a lot of people seem to think it's just, well, unless they can compete in the free market, unless it's part of that kind of standard business model, capitalism, if you like, which is a dirty word for some people. And it's also reminding people, although I corrected you when you said voluntary communes, because I didn't want the commie association, but even when I talk to people of that persuasion, I say to them, look, in a free society, you can have your voluntary communes as well. But that wasn't what I was talking about when I was talking about voluntary collectives. But that it strikes at the same principle. So it's really just kind of getting that message across by saying, look, it doesn't all have to be about sort of standard business models and that. People can get together. They can, like I say, we could still, in theory, even in a free society, we could still have a national health service that provided free to the service, obviously not free because people have got to pay for it somehow. But the fact of the matter is it would be paid for through voluntary means. And that doesn't necessarily mean standard donations. We've got more sort of sophisticated ideas. And it's kind of like, I know it doesn't affect the principle. And one of the things I always like to emphasize is, look, giving you alternatives and examples of how things can exist in a free society doesn't change the principle. It's like coming up with different ways to pick the corn doesn't change the argument on slavery. Slavery's wrong, there you go. But it also doesn't hurt to help people see how things would work in a post-slavery world, just like it also is a good idea to help people see how things would work in a free society. Like I say, it doesn't affect the principle, and even if I couldn't come up with any ideas on novel ways that we could do things in a free society, it wouldn't change the basic argument on a principle level. But I still think there's use in, kind of helping people see it. Because I think a lot of people, especially when you talk about anarchism, they think of chaos, they think of Molotov cocktails being thrown through shop windows and all sorts of mayhem, you know what I mean? And my kind of point is like, well, look, society doesn't have to exist that differently to how it does now. Just take all the coercion out of it, take all of the ruling authorities out of it, let everybody have their equal right to their own self, which is the only right anybody has. And however we organise from there doesn't really matter, but it's good to show when people say, well, how could this work? Well, it could work like this. It could work like that. Like I said, I present a few alternatives to taxation, for example, that are non-coercive, but provide a similar kind of funding for sort of public services and stuff like that. So,
wow, there's like 1,000 ways we could go with this conversation, which excites me. So let me begin with a comment from Frontal Cortex, who's one of our supporters. So thank you for your support, Frontal. But he says, I don't think trying to change an entire country to a voluntary society would work first. Seems like maybe one county at a time. Otherwise, it's buy private property and make our own. He says he'd want one to have to pass an IQ test before admittance. Unfortunate reality. I think the best case scenario transition to any kind of freedom would be, slowly like ignoring the government out of existence by having enough people sort of over time realizing or coming to realize these ideas are the best ones and the most ethical ones to live by. And that, I think, the transition would result in it's not going to be like a light switch where 300 million people, suddenly like wake up and ignore government. It's definitely going to be, it's going to begin by being concentrated in an area. In fact, maybe even in a free state project like Paradigm, where people concentrate themselves in an area for the purposes of reaching that critical mass faster. So I think he's right on that. What was I going to say about that, though? So, yeah, I was going to agree with you that I think it is important and it's worthwhile to spend time actually laying some foundations, laying some groundwork for how this will actually function in real life. I think, if we're not prepared, then it's like when I was talking to people in the Libertarian Party, and I was telling them, look, this political activism is not the way to achieve freedom. Begging people to elect you to office to, ride in like a white knight and provide them freedom will not function. That is just not how it works. And so then they respond by looking at me and saying, well, what do you think I should be doing? What's my alternative, Patrick? What do I need? Tell me what to do. Give me an option. And if you don't have something, then they just ignore you and continue doing what they're doing. And that's kind of a holy crap.
All the best to you and your family, good sir.
EG. Dude, one day you've got to tell me who the hell you are so I can thank you properly. $100 donation, EG. Holy crap. He does that every once in a while in these streams, and it just totally, I forget what the hell I was even thinking about. Dude, EG, thank you very much. He says, all the best to you and your family, good sir. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. What the hell was I saying? Oh yeah, so you need an option. You need to be able to say, okay, well, here's what you can do instead. And so the same thing I think is important for a free society or a free community or not a collective? What'd you call it?
Voluntary collective.
Yeah, let's go with collective. So you need to have a structure in place so that when we finally start getting close to the tipping point, when we're starting to gain critical mass in an area, that you actually have some kind of already reasoned out and maybe philosophically debate-hardened strategy ready to at least try. I mean, certainly even then it's probably going to still be rough around the edges and not work out like you thought and will need refinement, but you got to have something. If you don't have something, people are not going to take it seriously. They're going to continue doing what they were doing. So to that end, I appreciate the work. I always say this, I think every time we talk, I appreciate the work you're doing. I think it's important work. Also, just to illustrate something else that I've been working on along those same lines, before this health stuff happened to my family, one of the projects that I was going to work on this year in 2019 was to actually create a voluntarist NAP-based dispute resolution company, like an actual functioning, even now, functioning dispute resolution company that used the rubric of voluntarist and non-aggression principle ideas to resolve disputes and to help people enforce contracts that they've signed with others voluntarily. And then I was going to offer it to, so Anarchapulco had some disputes last year, and I was going to offer it to Anarchapulco as to be the dispute resolution company for the event going forward. I did not have time, for obvious reasons, this year to actually spin that up and get it working. But I had reached out to Judge Andrew Napolitano, who's not only a legal mind, but also an anarcho-capitalist, though he probably wouldn't use those words, to maybe be a consultant or an advisory board member or something along those lines. So I when I say that I appreciate the work that you're doing, I not only appreciate it and I not only agree that it's the right thing to do, but I'm doing it too. That is one of my goals, is to actually make forward progress. Let's just not talk about one day when we have a free society, it might work like this. It's well, I think we can make a little extra progress than that. I think we can actually get some stuff ready to go so that, when the opportunity presents itself, we're not just oh shit, we need to figure out how to run a dispute resolution company. Oh shit, how do we do this stuff? So, yeah, that's good. That was...
Yeah. I mean, I agree, obviously. And just to touch on the point that you and the commenter made with regards to, like, thinking that I mean, I do understand that the evolution versus revolution kind of thing, and we are sort of moving that way. And I totally support and applaud the efforts to make government irrelevant and do all of those things. I'm certainly not knocking those efforts. But the problem with those efforts, and this is where kind of what motivated me a bit with, my idea, is it's a bit difficult to ignore the government when they've got a gun in your face. And there's obviously a lot we can do still. That's not an excuse to do nothing. Oh, we've got a state, so, but, and like I say, I applaud all the efforts but there is still a lot of things that we can't do because we have a government that would literally use force to stop us. And that's kind of like, I see that as a big problem. And although even the kind of revolution that I'm proposing still needs an evolution to get the ideas across to enough people to sort of make that kind of thing happen, I do think at a certain point we need a tipping point where we as a society actually say, okay, this is how it's going to be. A little bit like when we abolished slavery and said, okay, from now on, it's not just we're not going to be doing slavery and we're going to try to make the slave drivers irrelevant. We're saying it's abolished. We're saying it's a crime against people, and we can use force to stop you, as an act of defense, because defense isn't just defending yourself. It can be defending others, and all of that sort of thing. So it's kind of like the same idea in my head is like, I don't just want to make it irrelevant. I want to abolish government, and not just government, all entities that would violate the non-aggression principle. I want us to have a society where, as a society, we recognize everybody's right to self-ownership is recognized, respected, and protected. And it's not going to be recognized, respected, and protected by everybody. We're still obviously going to have criminals. But if we actually have a society that at the very top level says, this is how it has to be, this is the law, everyone owns themselves, and that's that. And like I say, that would have to be established through a peace agreement, obviously, because you can't do it through a ruling authority, because a ruling authority is a violation of the law you're establishing. So, so that's kind of my nuanced.
It's that nuanced. It's that little nuanced semi-contradiction there that has left us debating each other for hours and hours, just to make sure that I fully understand what you're trying to say. So, it almost seems like I'm saying almost, because it's not, but it almost seems like the Randian conception of government, which is like this utopian form of government that never violates anyone's consent or doesn't tax and doesn't take anyone's property, and at the same time, well, Rand would have it, also forcibly prevent competition, which is obviously the break in the logic, which you wouldn't have. So, yeah, that's interesting. I guess I remember our original conversation. We started trying to we spent a lot of time trying to define like what are rights, who gets them, and how. And I think in our original conversation we were talking about trying to establish the non-aggression principle from first principles in a way that you could sort of, like you were just describing, overtly apply it to people that didn't necessarily, consent's the wrong word, because it's, it's negative obligations. It would sort of be like, correct me if I'm wrong, is this are you trying to establish like an organization of people that consent to work together to not only sort of defend themselves, but also to defend others that may not be in the community? Or in the collective? No, I forgot what word we're using. Not commune, collective.
That would be, that would be the implication to it. Yeah, I mean, that's not the only implication, but yeah, that's the kind of, because like I say, there's a lot of anarchists, and like I say, they're doing great work. I'm not knocking them. That are making the government irrelevant and showing how we can break away from that. But I still I look at all the people that can't break away, and it's kind of like I don't want to sound self-aggrandizing, but it's like I don't want to just free myself I want everyone to be free. You know, we all should be free. We all own ourselves. You know, it's a universal right. It's a universal principle. And I want us to make it a universal law. And a lot of anarchists kind of shudder at the word law because of the sort of statist implications that might run around in their heads with it. But I kind of like that's why I kind of keep saying established as through a peace agreement, you know, no ruling authority here, because obviously that would contradict the law you're establishing. And I'm trying to point out that I know law is traditionally always something that's been put down by a ruling authority, like a government or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, what law actually is a threat of force. It's saying, this is what you're not allowed to do. And it's not like a contractual agreement or rules, like conditions that you attach to a voluntary interaction. Like, I invite you into my house. I say, well, you've got to take your shoes off. And you can say, well, no. I'll say, all right, I'm not inviting you into my house then. You know, it's a rule attached to a voluntary agreement. So that's not like a law that I'm imposing. Whereas when I say you're not allowed to rob, rape, murder, and assault people, that doesn't depend on any agreement or whether you want to come in my house or not. That is something you're just flat out not allowed to do. So that's the kind of distinction with law as opposed to kind of like rules that exist within a voluntary setup. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I mean, people could certainly agree to interoperate with each other according to a rule that allowed those things. That would be dumb and anti-life, but okay. And I remember, I'm trying to figure out was there any open disagreements? And do you remember what those might have been? Because those might be good points to kind of revisit. Because, you know, I think when was our last conversation? 2 years ago? I forgot. It's been a long time, but you know, I spend almost every day of my life thinking about this stuff. So I'd like to think that. At least my positions are at least more refined since last time we spoke. So, do you remember? Did we have any disagreements?
Is this with the 5-hour conversation you're referring to, or the on the show conversation? Or either?
I'll go either for now. How about that?
Okay, well, I mean, with the show conversation, like we were mainly talking about the peace agreement, and just for anyone listening, just quickly so they know what this peace agreement is, it's a 3-part agreement. So the idea is part 1 is just the basic agreement to make the non-aggression principle the law. Part 2 is what I call the lines in the sand, where we set limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. And then part 3 is rightful ownership, where we ratify rightful ownership through the non-aggression principle. And our conversation was mainly focused on part 2.
Yeah, I remember.
Part 3 is rightful ownership. So ratifying rightful ownership through the non-aggression principle. Basically just kind of, you know, so once we've got the non-aggression principle as law, you know, we know what property rights are in accordance to that. So we're basically saying, well, okay, this is how we can ratify what's rightfully owned compared to what's been stolen. Obviously, everything that government's got is in the stolen department, you know, so...
Yeah, H. Reardon, I've seen you post the same question 3 times. Is that to us? Because that I don't really know how. Is that to us, or is that a rhetorical? You phrased it like a rhetorical question, so that's why I haven't said anything yet. So I do remember point number 2 being the point of contention, because I'm trying to load in hours of conversation from years ago into my head. I remember my position was that wow, guys. Hey, thanks for the subscription. Appreciate it. My favorite songs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. I was arguing, and I would still probably take this stance that there is no ambiguity. There are no gray areas in the non-aggression principle. Only areas that we haven't put enough thought into and done enough work on to achieve the actual sort of objective answer to. And I think we went back and forth on that a long time ago. We talked about some of the supposed gray areas that a lot of people see and find in the non-aggression principle. Jim Jesus donated $2, says he's watching this and eating Carolina Reapers. Wow. Spicy. The point of number 2 would be to sort of, I guess, assume that there were still some gray areas and to just have people sort of voluntarily join the collectives that had the interpretations that they most agreed with. Like, there are people that profess to live by the nap and think it's chill to, kill babies in the womb. So like that would be a good example of. Sorry.
Well, just to add a little correction, because this whole law thing, this establishing the NAP as law for agreement, that's to apply to everybody. So like, it doesn't matter what voluntary collective you're in. So like this lines in the sand of part 2, because there are different. I mean, my point, because I think we did disagree about this existence of fuzzy edges and the existence of grey areas with regards to where we draw exact lines. I mean, I do still think there is some. Whether it's just because we're not able to approach it with a high enough resolution to locate the objective line, or whether it's because it's not there or whatever. But my point is even if you're right and there is an objective line, either way, we need to draw it so everyone knows where they stand. So this part 2 thing, but this isn't this part 2, this line isn't a line for, so different voluntary collectives can have different lines. I mean, they can have different lines, as long as I don't cross this line. Like this line is the line in the sand where we say, no, you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle. So it's not about whether you're in this collective or that collective or whatever. Like the whole idea of making this non-aggression principle the law, because we can have different rules with communities that people voluntarily submit to. My whole idea, the whole thing about having the non-aggression principle as a law is saying, no, that applies to everybody, whether they agree or not, whether they're part of a collective or not, that applies to everybody. So, like I say, that the part 1 is that basic agreement to make that the law. Part 2 is basically saying, okay, well, where there are these arguments over differing interpretations, whether we agree there's a grey area or not, we both agree that there is a line that we can both say, look, this is definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle, and we're not going to take any people saying, well, no, you could interpret. No, this is where that, like, what I'm saying is where people say that there's a grey area exists, I'm saying that might exist, but it only exists to a point. Like, I mean, the metaphor.
Give me an example. I need an example. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, there can be lots of things. I mean, I often use age of consent as an example, but I think it can be like, if I swing my fists within inches of your face, I'm obviously violating the non-aggression principle. I don't have to necessarily punch, like actually connect. If I'm sort of getting in your face and swinging at you, that's an act of aggression. I think we both agree. If I was standing 30 feet away doing some aerobics that involves swinging my fist in your direction, that's obviously not. Now, I know I'm using kind of absurdly simplistic example here, but what I'm saying is at some point there is a line. Do you know what I'm saying? Or it's like how much pollution could somebody say is definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle? Like someone moves in next to you and is smoking a cigarette in their garden, and they've got a massive garden, and it's not really, but you might say, well, there's a particle of smoke that might be entering what I consider my property area or whatever. It's kind of separating that from me literally pumping out massive loads of toxic gas. And, I know these are kind of silly. I mean, the age of consent one is another example of where a line is drawn, because we treat children differently to how we would treat adults with regards to the fact that children can't consent. So a child can't consent to a legal contract, sex and drugs, obviously. So my point is always, well, okay, but there is still a debate over exactly when a child becomes an adult and all of this. But there's a limit to that. There's a limit to that, because we have the distinction. We have a child and we have an adult, and an adult can consent to a legal contract because they can understand it, and they can, that self-ownership, that competency, a little bit like how we have people that are competent to stand trial and stuff like that. We determine stuff like that. And what I'm saying is there is, I think when you talk about these standards, there is an area where reasonable people can disagree, where reasonable people can have a reasonable conversation and say, well, I think it's actually at this point, and I think it's at this point. But those reasonable people can say, okay, well, it's definitely not at this point, though. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like drawing a limit to tolerance to say, okay, at this point, it's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle, and we would be able to enforce this on a universal, regardless of who you were and what have you.
I remember why I disagreed with you now. Thanks for that explanation. So the thing that you can't do is enforce a subjective interpretation on somebody that hasn't consented to that subjective interpretation. And every example you just listed had a subjective interpretation. at least the way you explained it. So the swinging fist in front of your face, like I did a video on this a while back, talking about threat of force not being part of the non-aggression principle because you cannot come up with a universalizable definition of threat. And this is a position that I hate, and I don't like having this position, but I have yet to find anyone that can create a universalizable definition of a threat. Swinging your fist in front of my face might be perfectly. It could be not a threat. Like all threats are subjective, I guess, is the conclusion there. So maybe that's a conversation that we could have. And if you want to remind me of the other examples that you gave, maybe I could point out where I saw the subjectivity in those as well.
Well, like the transition from child to adult, as it concerns things like consent.
So I think this is an area where I have found an objective way to delineate that line, and we can talk about age of consent if you want. That's a deep, deep hole that gets people riled up for sure. But I think that, and the threat thing, let me be clear, the threat issue might have an answer too. I'm just saying I haven't found one yet. And so my current position is one that I don't like, that I don't see an objective definition of a threat, an objective or universalizable definition of threat out there.
Well, I would disagree with you there, but I mean, I would also say that I can understand what you're saying, because I think if you, like you can kind of discuss things or look at things at sort of different resolutions. You can kind of look at things at a low resolution where you're not sort of getting into the minutiae, and then you can kind of really focus in. I think if you focus in enough, I think you can kind of find subjectivity in anything. Like even when we get into physical contact, it's kind of like, well, people could still argue there, because not every time someone touches you is it assault. Like someone might accidentally slightly brush up against you walking past you or something like that. You don't get to call that a non-aggression principle violation.
It's called assault by touch. No, that's even in law now. It's called assault by touch. You can't touch people. It's just like most normal, decent people, would not object to that, but some people might.
But there's sometimes when, I don't mean like, there's sometimes when you might, like if you got on a train or something and you're crowded, it's not possible to guarantee that you're going to avoid touching people. I don't think you violate the non-aggression principle every time you do. I mean, I also, to be honest, I actually do also
touch
disagree
people
with
against
you.
Their consent. It sounds like you're saying that.
Not against their consent, because that's the other thing as well. If someone says "don't touch me" and you touch them, but there's such a thing called implicit contract. Like I was talking to Walter Block a little while ago.
We're in social contract territory now. Sorry, go ahead. Oh, and everyone, please.
Implicit.
Please excuse my very statist mug for today. The thing is, like, I enjoy a lot of coffee, and the only way to get large cups is to go to a Texas novelty store, because everything is bigger in Texas, and so that's where they sell the big cups, and then it always comes with the flag on it. That's the Texas state flag. Anyway,
fair enough.
Yeah,
sorry. I just want to clarify: not against consent, because that's obviously a different thing. If someone's expressly said "don't touch me" and you touch them, and that is but there's such a thing as, I didn't say social contract, in contract, right? So like, say for example, you see somebody that's about to get hit by a bus and you push them out of the way. Okay, my argument with this, and you might disagree with me on this, but I'd be interested if you would do. But my argument is that's not a non-aggression principle violation, because it falls under the realms of implicit contract. Like, it's reasonable. I know this kind of reeks of subjectivity to a certain degree.
Yeah, yeah. What?
Well, it's reasonable to assume that you would have consent from them.
Who defines what's reasonable? Not you or the person you're pushing?
Well, I think it's like this. It's like, because some people say to me about the fact that you don't get consent from your children to bring them into the world. And I use implicit contract with that. I kind of say, well, it's reasonable to assume that as long as you look after them, that they would choose to be brought in. They would choose existence over non-existence. It's reasonable to assume that if someone's about to get hit by a bus, they don't have time to articulate their consent to you touching them. It's like an emergency situation. these are things that I would argue fall under the realms of implicit contract.
Well, you
I'm
think
happy
it's
to discuss
reasonable,
this
but the
concept,
person might not, right?
Fair enough. He might not. He might have wanted to kill himself. So, but what I would say is once he's said, "Oh, hey, I wanted to kill myself," I'm like, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry." Once he's told you that, then you can't touch him, and then you can't stop him from the imminent danger.
So you're saying he has a positive obligation to communicate with you, like to express his consent?
No, I wouldn't say he's got a positive obligation. I'm just saying that
you get to assault him if he doesn't communicate with you. How is that not a positive obligation?
Okay. Well, how about this then, right? I know you're saying. I always have fun with our talks. I know what you're saying, but I do actually think. I never thought I'd say this to anybody because I always thought I'd be the one looking at it at the most highest resolution.
Here it comes.
But I do think you look at this at too high a resolution. I know that might sound silly on the face of it, but I actually think you're being too pedantic about this because
I've got something for this. I've got something for this.
Oh no! Don't show me in.
Sorry. Please continue.
You invoked the Molyneux.
Oh man, I love that one.
No, but what I'm saying is like, say somebody came up to you and held out their hand in a gesture that you would recognize as them wanting to shake it. Perhaps they even said, hi Patrick, nice to meet you. And they extended their hand. They never actually said, I want you to touch me. But for me, it's reasonable to assume because, let's say they come from a culture where people don't touch you when you put out their hands. Perhaps, it's some gesture to say hello where they just put their hands out and you touch their hand. My point is you haven't assaulted them. And like I say, I'm invoking this implicit contract business because I'm basically saying it's reasonable to assume that there was no, I mean, for one thing, there's no mens rea there with regards to, because like I'm kind of equating non-aggression principle violations to crimes on some level. There's no mens rea. It's like an honest mistake, I don't really know.
Let me speak for a little bit. Let me speak for a little bit on. Because there's several things that are sticking out as problems with me. First of all, mens rea. So, like, the person's intent can never affect whether or not there's been a non-aggression principle violation. That's a hopelessly subjective mess. The other thing I was going to say is, like, if you found an African tribe that it was their local subjective cultural norm, just stick their hands out in that typical position, that we have when we want to shake someone's hand. And then that was it. You weren't supposed to touch them afterwards. Or maybe it was even their tradition that if you did touch them, that was, a challenge to war or, even an outright attack on them. Then you can't apply what you consider reasonable to their expectations of interaction because it is it is necessarily up to the person having their property manipulated to decide if it's consensual or not. Like, there's no way to avoid that. Now, that's why we're talking about your number two, because there's nothing wrong with subjective, localized cultural norms. In fact, they're necessary for, like, polite, conflict-free survival. Like, we had an episode on doorbell bombs a long time ago. I don't know if you saw that one, but it really makes a visceral case about what I'm talking about. Like installing a bomb into my doorbell such that if somebody rang it, they would blow them up. That would not be a violation of the non-aggression principle. It's my house, it's my home, it's my doorbell. I own it. I own the bomb. I own the wire. I connect the two. I still own everything. And it's not. And if somebody trespasses and rings the doorbell and get blown up, well, that's not on me. That is according to like raw, basic non-aggression principle application. That's not a violation of the NAP. However, obviously, no one would want to live in a collective that was okay, or, well, I can't say no one. Maybe there's a crazy community of like nut jobs that want to have doorbell bombs. But the point is, they would all know that doorbell bombs were a thing and probably wouldn't go around pushing buttons on other people's property. So like there are, I guess my summary is that there are a long list of rules that are very subjective that as long as you agree to, then they can, I guess what I'm saying is your number two it seems like it tries to take some points of subjectivity and then make those points of subjectivity apply to people that don't consent by saying that these are the minimum standards. Well, the minimum standard is no doorbell bomb. Well, there could be 100 people in that town over there that like doorbell bombs, and who are you to tell them how they can't use their property? Just as an example. So those are my couple sticking points.
We did actually discuss the doorbell bomb in our kind of after show bit, like discussion actually, because I disagreed with you on some bits of it. But you laid it out there where someone actually has to go onto your property to activate this bomb, then I would agree with you that it's not a non-aggression principle violation and they're trespassing and what have you. But I did say that I do think that if it's on the external part of the property to the point that somebody who's not trespassing could touch that doorbell, then I actually think, but again, we're kind of uncovering a point of disagreement here because I do think that.
Are you on a laptop? Can you tilt your camera down just a little bit?
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah.
There we go.
Is that better like that?
Yeah, much better. Sorry.
I do think that trying to think how best to do. Like basically, the reason where I disagree with you on the doorbell bomb was I was like saying if it's at the external end of the property and you've got a doorbell, someone who's not even trespassing or whatever could push that. For me, that's a trap. That is a non-aggression principle violation. It's a trap because it's reasonable to assume that someone would mistake that, just like someone would mistake
every time
extending your hand.
Every time you say the word reasonable, I throw a flag on the field. Because that word is open to whose interpretation of what's reasonable. Like, I'm just going to throw a flag right there. Can you reframe without using that word?
Not really, because I actually think this is where we're at. I think this is kind of a disagreement that we're having. I think this is kind of pinpointing it because I do think that you have to, at certain points, in certain contexts, invoke reasonable standards. And I know that screams of subjectivity, which is, I know that's why you're throwing your flags. I do understand your kind of objection there, but I do just think that, and, you know, like I say, to use the example of the person, I know, because the thing is, it's all very well if you go over to this tribe, you don't know their cultures, maybe you'll take a bit more caution or whatever. But my point about this non-aggression principle law thing, this isn't about social norms and subjective rules. This is about something that's universal. And my point is, yeah, if someone has a custom like that, that's all well and good. But you're not a mind reader. You can't be expected to know that when they do something that's a gesture, because the thing is our communications aren't, the problem is I think from your point of view is everything would have to be verbally articulated. Whereas I'm kind of making the point that our communications are different. They're not just verbal. And there are certain aspects where I think there's got to be room for misunderstanding. There's got to be room for error that isn't a violation, that doesn't permit force being used against you. You know, like if like I say, if someone came up to you and said, "Oh, hi Patrick, nice to meet you," and held their hand, and you went to shake their hand, they went, "Hey, I don't, do that or anything." For me, you didn't assault them. If you did it after they told you and informed you that, hey, no, that's not what I meant, I wasn't putting my hand out for that, then you would be assaulting them. But I just think, because for me, it's kind of like demanding that you're going to psychically know. You know what I mean? Because I know they haven't explicitly. Do you know what I'm saying? Do you kind of get what I'm saying?
Oh, I know what you're saying. I think I just disagree. So, like, I don't think you have to call it a non-crime to have it be, because you want it to be a non-issue. Like, you want me shaking someone's hand in that situation and them actually tricking me and actually, calling that assault. You want that to be a non-issue. That's the goal of what you're trying to do. But you can't enforce that subjective interpretation of what reason is on people that don't consent. However, Fred in the comments had a good point that I should have thought of to bring up, which is like, okay, let's call it an assault, and let's put it through our dispute resolution process. Let's have him declare damages, and let's make our cases. And I'll be like, well, he held his hand out to me, as everyone does when they want to shake my hand in the area, and he said, hey, nice to meet you, Patrick, as everyone does when they want to shake my hand in the area. And he did this and he did this, and maybe we were meeting each other for the first time, which is another tradition in which we would shake hands, right? And so I would make my case, and the other guy would say, well, it's my body. It's my body, my choice. I can do all of those things and still not consent to him touching me. And then the jury would be like, this guy's fucking nuts, but it was technically an assault or whatever. So let's award him $1.56 for so he can go buy himself a Coke to make himself feel better. It's like, okay, done, and I give him $1.50, he gets his Coke, and we, go about our day. And then maybe the result of that is that his dispute resolution stops working with him for wasting their fucking resources. So, and then, then maybe he has a hard time finding representation in the future because he's making frivolous, stupid claims that, are technically, violations, but they're so minor in nature that it's not profitable for the dispute resolution company to continue fighting for his case. Like, or maybe, in that they would have all that in the actual contract that the guy would sign when he was getting the resolution representation. And there's nothing. So what I'm saying is we can both have what we want here. It's just that we can't enforce these standards on people that don't consent. It's that we can have these standards. They just need to be explicit if they are to be enforced. So if you wanted a situation in which a guy could do all those things, stick out his hand and whatever, and then me touch him and then him say that was assault, and then there be some kind of system governing that says, that's not assault. You can't even raise that claim of assault against him. That has to be agreed to because, like, by definition, I have interacted with his property against his consent. That's kind of what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is a realistic scenario. I think we both agree this is not a realistic scenario. Yeah. But, talking about these edge cases is important. So what do you say about that?
It helps establish the principle to even talk about absurd examples. But the problem with that is, I still think you're invoking sort of subjectivity there with regards to making the decision it's assault. But let's say that because the thing is, if someone actually assaults me, like in what I consider assault, like with my reasonable standards, then not only do I
need an actual flag to throw now. Go ahead, sorry.
But. So I forgot what I was going to say.
I'm sorry, I disrupted you.
That's right. It will come back to me in a minute. My brain likes to let go of threads and then pick them up after a moment of darkness. What were we talking about? That'll help me remember. Sorry, what were we talking about? That'll help me remember.
We were talking about courts and explicit versus implicit versus like consent that you could, like rules that you could enforce, subjective rules that you could enforce on other people without their consent.
Right. Okay. Yeah. The problem is. I'm not.
So like, who's to say that we can't use your same reasonable argument to say that it's reasonable for a cop to be able to fine me $200 for going too fast on the public roads? It's reasonable. That is reasonable to a lot of people. So if reasonable is the standard, then you're using a statist argument for using force on me for a rule I didn't agree to.
Yeah, but then it's not a reasonable interpretation of the non-aggression principle. It's nothing to do with the non-aggression principle. That's reasonable in their own little statist minds. I'm talking about reasonable standards when you're interpreting the non-aggression principle. So it's like, Oh yeah, I've remembered what I was going to say.
Good.
The problem is when somebody assaults you, you have the right, unless this is another area that we disagree with, but you have the right to use force in defense. Okay, like someone just starts attacking me, punching me, or whatever. I have the right to use physical violence to restrain that person, to stop the attack, what have you. So going back to the handshaking incident, which I realize is very obscure, but my point is it's not a non-aggression principle violation, because if it was, then the person would have the right to respond with force. And my point is, someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, Patrick, nice to meet you," and you go to shake their hand, they don't then get to punch you in the face and say you assaulted them because you touched their, you know what I'm saying? It's kind of, I know that's probably not a proportionate response.
Exactly, proportionate, right. Yep.
But is that not also subjective? Proportionate response.
Absolutely.
What I'm saying is
yeah, but there's nothing in the NAP about proportionality. Like that's why it's so important to draw the distinction between what I call like on the island versus in the city, right? So like there's this raw interpretation of right and wrong that we get from the non-aggression principle that's very raw and very visceral and dangerous and rough and it's very, it's like, it's the most basic form of ethics that would function in a state of nature. It's not something that might be, it shouldn't be the only rule in any kind of polite society. It would just be too rough. It would be too raw. You need more. And the more that you get, you have to, a lot of it has to be subjective. Like I would love for you to show me how we can achieve the perfect amount of signaling necessary to say that you want your handshake from first principles. If you can do that, I will like applaud. That would be a feat of philosophy like no one has ever seen. I don't think you're going to get there. And so, and I'm making the case that that's okay. We can have, subjective cultural norms and interpretations. It would be like trying to, I don't know if you're a programmer, it would be like trying to write the entire Microsoft Windows operating system in Notepad with two keys, the 0 and 1 keys on your keyboard. Like you're trying to achieve something that is so vastly complex with so many interactions, using the lowest bare metal methodology to get there. That's how I see the NAP. And I'm not disparaging the NAP by saying that. I'm saying none of the stuff that you build on top of the NAP should be able to violate the NAP. There's still that forward enforcement of the basic principles. But I'm saying that, it's not enough. For a complex society with so many different interactions and types of interactions. Hopefully I made that case well.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but it's like, to go back to the handshaking guy, if the guy did respond by punching the person in the face because they touched their hand, from how I view the NAP, the person who punched the guy in the face violated the non-aggression principle because he wasn't responding to an act of aggression. Because I suppose this is where I'm coming from when I say it's not a violation of the non-aggression principle to shake someone's hand when they've gestured in a way that a reasonable person. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep saying it because the reason why is because, and this is we've uncovered a real disagreement here, because I don't think you can escape 100% at the most, the highest resolution you go to. I don't think you can escape subjectivity, but I also think you don't need to. I think that you have to have reasonable standards, because you need to deal with proportionality of response. Because what would you do with that guy who punched him in the face? What would the dispute resolution in your world say about that incident? I know it's obscure, but it helps us.
I want to make sure that we're not talking past each other. I am also saying that you have to have reasonable standards. I'm just saying that you can't overtly apply what you think is reasonable standards to literally everyone without their consent. That's my point.
Okay, well, I mean, this is why it can't just be this is why this lines in the sand thing of part 2, the kind of bar for that is where it's still reasonable. I can't get away from that. So I've got to be honest about what I'm presenting here.
We can't proceed in the conversation if you keep using that word and I keep saying, hey, it's subjective, you can't do that. So I think to continue in this conversation, you have to explain to me how you can apply subjective interpretations of what's reasonable to someone that hasn't consented. Otherwise, we're stuck here, and we might as well stop talking.
Well, my argument is that there is a kind of I was just about to say reasonable standard again, but my argument is, and this is where I come out with this whole grey fuzzy area. Is my argument is there is like this subjectivity where people can agree to disagree, and people can solve that in the way that you described by, you know, applying more defined rules as long as you're not violating the non-aggression principle. I mean, the thing is, you can build any kind of rules as long as you're not violating the non-aggression principle, even rules that would violate the non-aggression principle if they were laws. You know, like if they were applied to everybody. What I'm saying is like the whole point of the non-aggression principle is that you can apply it to everybody. You can say to everybody, regardless of what rules they've agreed to or whatever, that they're not allowed to violate another person's self-ownership. They're not allowed to rob them, rape them, murder them, assault them, and the same to their property and all the rest of it. And I also think that threatening and attempting is included in that. But that's obviously another point of disagreement that we have. But my point is because you've got this principle that you can enforce, that you can use force against people to enforce, and on anyone, regardless of whether they're part of your community or whatever. Because I'm saying you've got that, I'm saying you have to draw a line where you separate what definitely is a violation of the non-aggression principle, so you can use force against anybody, regardless of who they are, and separate that from these murky areas where reasonable people can disagree. And what you can say is okay, well, that area is something we can't enforce because it's too subjective. It is too, in that realms of what you're talking about. But what I'm saying is there's a limit to that. There's a line you have to draw where we say, okay, at this point, even if it's still invoking the subjectivity of reasonable standards, but it's doing it at a kind of a level where we can kind of say, you're insane if you don't. I mean, this is kind of the whole. I suppose I do lose it. I will admit I'm losing a little bit of this kind of claim to objectivity with the non-aggression principle. But that's why I say the lines in the sand have to be drawn at the kind of at that base where you can say for certain, because I do agree with you that you can't just enforce your own subjective standards. But my point is when we're drawing this line in the sand, it's not just my subjective standards with regards to my preference. It's what we're saying is a reasonable interpretation of the non-aggression principle. And someone just made this in real time from this conversation. This is brought to you by Jim funny. Jesus. I think he's got a template because he did one of me recently too. Can you post the one of me again? I want to show that. That was hilarious, Jim. Thank you. Don't shake my head. That's great. I mean, as obscure as it is, though, it does. I mean, it's a kind of the reason why it's good to use obscure examples is because it simplifies the point to the more nuanced, more realistic examples. But that is my point of it. I do think that we communicate in different ways. I mean. And all right, maybe this is too obscure, but I think we're going to go to this level. Sorry to interrupt. This is his meme of me from a conversation. So this was from a conversation I had. I interviewed a dude a local Dallas activist that went to Hong Kong to participate in the freedom fight there. I don't know if you saw that show. And apparently at some point in that show, I'm like, this guy is, one of the rare few that will put his ass where his mouth is, meaning that he took action based on his personal words and beliefs. Yeah. And then this flag came out of it. So you're welcome. Thank you, Jim, and you're welcome, audience, for showing that off to me. That is now forever going to be on my channel. Yeah. So please continue. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry, but what I'm saying is if you keep zooming into a more and more higher resolution you'll never escape subjectivity, and it can literally get to the point where someone could speak a language that's a totally different language, and they might, I know this is getting really absurd here, but they might have a language where they say words that in their language mean please move away from me, but in your language means I'd like a hug please. I know it sounds like stupid, but you see my point. What I'm saying is in day-to-day life, we have to invoke reasonable standards. We have to have some line of where we say, look, we communicate not just through precise words, we communicate through body language and what have you, and sometimes that can be misinterpreted. Someone could say, oh, I'd like to invite you over to my house, maybe tomorrow night at 6, and you come over and they say, hey, what are you doing? You're trespassing. You say, well, you invite me over to the house. You say, no, I just said that I'd like to, but I didn't. You know, I mean, I know it's stupid stuff, but this is the kind of reason why we need reasonable standards, because people will take the piss if you don't have it.
Please stop explaining to me why we need reasonable standards, because I don't disagree with you there. I'm just saying that, you know, a collective of people, a group of people, will need to agree to them. To make them enforceable. And here's why you're playing with fire if you don't think that they have to get agreement to be enforced, because it's the exact same thing that governments do now. So like we have these red flag laws that are trying to be created here in the country that say that you can be attacked and have your weapons taken from you, and even up to being incarcerated in a mental institution for observation for 30 days if they think that in their reasonable opinion you are a threat to somebody. And so it is taking the same justification that you're using to apply subjective interpretations of behavior to remove someone's protection from being assaulted or touched or having their property adversely affected in some way. You can't do that. The difference between a voluntarist society and a statist society is getting consent to the rules that govern you, that are getting consent to the subjective rules that govern you. Now, I'm going to, let's argue the other direction now, Firm. Let me let you respond to that, and then I'll argue from the other direction, because I gave you a lot. Go ahead.
Just to clarify, I mean, when I was just you're saying, oh, you don't need me to make the argument of why we need reasonable standards because you agree with me. I'm making the argument, which you don't agree with, that this is why we need reasonable standards with regards to what we're enforcing as law. Like I say, this is my whole thing about the non-aggression principle. It's what we are enforcing this on everybody. We're not checking whether the rapist is part of our community and agreed to, we're saying this is objectively a violation of self-ownership, so we can use force. So my point is because we're doing that, then we do need to do something about the subjective standards with the law. We can't just leave it to voluntary collective, because what about when the man who's going to trick you by getting you to shake his hand so he can punch you in the face, if he's not part of any kind of collective where you've agreed like these social norms or whatever, then he can just punch you in the face because you mistook his gesture. And I'm saying that he can't do that. I'm saying that at some point we have to invoke reasonable standards. And even if you say that you've got to be so ridiculous with it that it would like I say, if I spoke a language where I said words that sounded a lot like English words that meant totally different things, and I said a sentence that in my language means please leave me alone, and your language means come over and give me a hug, and or like I say, or I use vague language when I talk about wanting to invite you over to my home, and you come over to my home, these kind of things. I know you're saying, and I want to just concede the point that the commenter made about how a lot of these examples would not be expedient, because if you wanted to take someone to a dispute resolution because they touched your hand when I get that, I understand that, and that is a fair point. But my point is it's not about expediency, it's about principle, it's about right and wrong. It's about, is that a violation of the non-aggression principle? If it is, you can use force to stop it or in response to it. If it's not, then you can't. And that's why I say we need to do something about this subjectivity to have these reasonable standards, not just in our own little groups where we've made the agreements ahead of time. We do need to do something about those reasonable standards issue in the matter of law as well, with regards to what we enforce to everybody.
I mean, you're trying to build in like the high level handshake cultural, cultural habits into the non-aggression principle, which is like 2 steps away from A equals A logically. Like you're trying to, like I said, you're trying to like run a program built on Windows 10 on, DOS 3.11. Like it's just, there is no connection between the two. And the only thing that you can connect the two with, ethically is consent. Like, and I'm not disagreeing that we don't need the program that runs on Windows 10. I'm just saying the only way you get from A to B is through consent, because there isn't a logical connection between the two. There is, and you've admitted this reason component is subjective. And anytime you stick a subjective component into this equation, that's where the universally enforceable part stops. So let me argue it from the other direction. So like,
okay.
There's such a variety of humans, and we can also even talk about like aliens from space in the future, whatever, it doesn't matter. There's such a wide variety of humans with such a wide variety of behavioral norms, cultural behaviors. Like even today in this highly advanced, just being like the most recent one in time, legal system, they're still building new precedents every day. Some new, never before tested conflict will come to a court, and they'll have to create new precedent for it. So, and this shit has been running for 2,000 years is kind of the beginning of this common law based justice system that we're running on now. So like we're 2,000 years in, and we're still almost every day having to develop new precedent and figure out the correct interpretation of answers to conflicts that are happening now. So to think that you'll ever be able to have like this one size fits all, this conclusive agreement between people, I don't see. I don't think that's a reasonable. I don't think that's a reasonable expectation. But like, so let me ask this: like, what's wrong with just trying to develop something that everybody can agree with? And the best way to do that would just be to like leave it at the raw NAP. Like you can have your NAP plus doorbell bomb society, and these people over there can have their NAP plus handshakes plus punching or something society over here, and that's fine. It's like you have a basic underlying operating system, kind of like the internet, where there's a basic protocol of interaction. And of consistency, but people, and they're going to do this anyway, even if you don't say they can. Like they're going to have their own structures built on top of the NAP. Like, why aren't we good to stop there? Like we're done. Like let's just work on maybe delineating the basic sort of inarguable conclusions that the non-aggression principle provides. Write those down. Call it done. Like, why do we need your item 2, which tries to subjectively interpret it stuff? Like, we can say murder is a violation of the non-aggression principle. We can say, touching people's hands against their consent is a violation of the non-aggression principle. And then the societies can agree on dispute resolution systems, or have competing dispute resolution systems, as we don't need to go into here, to resolve the never-ending, limitless ways over thousands of years that those simple rules will need to be applied in their own little cases.
But what about the subjectivity of expressing consent and stuff like that? What I'm saying is I just don't think you can ever escape it. Like so when you talk about these inalienable kind of definitions of definite, I mean, that's kind of what I want to do with this lines in the sand thing. I want to say, well, this is the line in the sand when it's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle. So I'm kind of like, what you're talking about, I suppose I feel like that's what part 2 is kind of doing, in addition to like part 1 is just agreeing in principle. Part 2 is setting the lines to kind of define that in a more high resolution way. But the problem is, if you say, well, you can't do that because no matter where you draw that line, it's subjective. I'm saying, well, yeah, but the problem is if you want to say that it's always subjective, then that can just apply to everything, including the consent. Like for one person, the putting the hand out and saying, "Hi, Patrick, nice to meet you," and gesturing to shake your hand is consent to you touching their hand. They misread it. They misunderstood because the other person, what I'm saying is without that universal standard, then people can't interact with each other unless they've gone through a long, drawn-out contractual process beforehand. Do you see what I'm saying? And because we are going to have a universal standard, because we're going to apply it to rapists and murderers, they don't need to sign a contract before we all use force to stop them from doing those things. But what I'm saying is we need to draw a line between that and the person that wants to claim that when someone touched his hand, they got assaulted, and that's why he responded violently. And it's even the proportionality thing. I do think we need to set standards for proportionality. And again, people might say, well, that's subjective, but you can bring the line down to a kind of real, a virtually inarguable level, so that you're staying as objective as possible. But I just think that if you keep getting to such a high resolution with your analysis, everything's subjective, and you can't enforce anything. And the nap starts to lose meaning when the guy who's tricking people into shaking his hand so he can punch them in the face is basically just going around punching people in the face. And the people on the other side of that are saying, well, he consented. He put his hand out and gestured for me to shake his hand. And well, in his little world, it doesn't mean that. And do you know what I'm saying? So I feel like the problem is not solved completely. It's very much alleviated by what you're talking about, by having the, and I do also advocate, that's what I talk about with the whole voluntary collective thing, because I say, the NAP alone is not enough as a universal law. People want more specific standards than that, and that's where this whole voluntary collective idea comes into it. So I do concede your point on that, and agree with it, but I'm saying that in addition to that, you also need a universal standard. You also need a standard that defines the NAP, even if it's on a real basic level, and even if the lines that we're drawing on part 2 are very, very rudimentary, I still think they need to be drawn. And even if you disagree that there's a grey area that's being separated from the black and white, there's still a line. Even if you think that line is razor thin and objective, there's still a line that needs to be drawn, if for no other reason than so people know where they stand on a kind of universal level. To kind of see what I'm saying? I know you don't agree, but does that make sense, what I'm saying, like the argument?
I don't see a problem with, we already have solutions for all the problems that you're bringing up. Like, if we just make the foundation the NAP, then all the confusion around handshake, punching, and all this stuff, those solutions already exist with the DROs and the dispute resolution and all this stuff. So it's not like I'm analyzing something at such a high resolution that I've lost the ability to provide solutions. No, it's just like we can start with the NAP and the DRO can handle the rest.
But what gives the DRO the right to have authority to make the final say when there's these disputes?
Their customers signing up to having their dispute resolution services.
But when people have got different DROs, or someone doesn't have a DRO at all,
I mean, that's going to be part of the agreement, just like your car insurance. Like there's a clause in your car insurance policy that tells you what's going to happen if somebody hits you that doesn't have insurance. Or if you hit somebody else, or that doesn't have insurance, something like that. So, like, this is all of these solutions have already been figured out.
But from the point of view of the person who doesn't have the DRO agreement, what I'm saying is from his point of view, why should he accept the DRO decision? Agree standards. Like, what authority do they have over here? Like what I'm saying is if this is all subjective and we can't enforce our standards at all, because I understand your concern with this, but I think at some point you have to, draw a line. What I'm saying is if you're rejecting that idea because you're saying, well, no, because you can't impose your standards, then how can the DRO impose standards on anybody other than people that have agreed to have those standards imposed on them?
So the whole point of ethics in general is to elevate us out of the state of nature. So the reality of the situation is that everyone is capable of doing whatever they want to each other. And the only way we elevate ourselves out of that is by mutual agreements that we call rights. And so if somebody stops reciprocating, then they also lose the benefit of other people respecting their rights, and they sort of return to the state of nature. So
I agree with that.
So if someone, doesn't want to participate in rights agreements, reciprocal rights agreements with other people, then other people don't have to participate in them with them. And, sorry if you think you're, like if they're damaging people, but wanting to be safe from being damaged, sorry, like, welcome to nature, MFer. Like, if you don't participate in rights, then, like, I'm sorry that you're upset that somebody, you can't, what I'm saying is you can't complain if other people hurt you if you're hurting other people. Like, that's self-contradictory.
Yeah, I understand that. But my point is like, your objection to the drawing the line through part 2 is because you're saying, well, yeah, but at some point you're imposing a standard on someone who hasn't consented. What I'm saying is the DRO would be doing the exact same thing every time they dealt with somebody who wasn't part of their DRO and hadn't agreed to their standards. So what I'm saying is if it's wrong for this peace agreement to draw these lines and say this is where you're crossing the line, which would be standard set ahead of time, why would it be okay for a DRO to do it to somebody who's not, agreed ahead of time to submit to their standards? What authority does the DRO have over somebody who hasn't signed up to their specific interpretations? So,
I'll pick the guy that handshook assaulted the guy, and which one? Let's set up the example, and I'll talk through it. So, which one doesn't have a DRO? The handshaker or the puncher?
Well, I mean, the argument could apply with either, but in my mind, I was thinking of the guy that's going around handshaking people and then punching them afterwards. What I'm saying, but it could be either way. It doesn't matter. The point is when the DRO, like, they've got a dispute over where to draw the line, and you're saying, well, we can have a DRO come in. Now that works well if both people are members of DROs, even if they're members of different DROs, because the DROs can negotiate and they would have agreed ahead of time to go with what their DRO says and all the rest of it. But when you've got a situation where somebody isn't part of a DRO, then does he not allowed to, can we rape and murder this person? No, of course not. He still has his self-ownership. He doesn't have to agree to specific interpretations. And what I'm saying is the point you made about the problem with imposing a standard, what I'm trying to do with the part 2, I don't see how that's any different to a DRO imposing a standard.
Well, because you voluntarily subscribe to the DRO, and you can pick which DRO you prefer.
But I'm saying in a scenario where you haven't subscribed to a DRO. I mean, if you voluntarily subscribe to a DRO, it's not a problem because you've agreed to those standards. So that's it. Here's your consent. I'm talking about when you haven't done that.
Do you see what I'm saying? The best analogy is driving without insurance. Like, you can drive without insurance all you want, and if you hit somebody, then you still owe them money, and if you don't have representation that works with their dispute resolution, then who are you to then tell them how they are to go about getting restitution for the damage that you created? Like, the DRO protects you just as much as it does the people that you might damage. So if you choose to not have a DRO, then you're foregoing a certain amount of protection. And I mean, what do you expect people to do? Let you get away with hitting them? Wrecking, smashing into their car? Like, I don't understand what you're saying here. Like, if you choose to not have a DRO and you hit somebody with your car, like, they are still owed restitution whether or not you have a DRO. And if you choose to not have a DRO and you try and not provide restitution, well, then take it to the laws of nature. Like, they can come take restitution if you're not going to participate in giving it. And I mean, that would all be NAP compliant.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is like, just to clarify, I assume that you agree that people that aren't members of DROs still have right of self-ownership. Like, we can't just murder them, rob them, rape them just because they're not part of a DRO, I assume.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'm saying is okay, so within that realm, we still have this issue with this whole, subjective standards, the reasonable standards thing. What I'm saying is my solution to that is this part 2 of this peace agreement, to draw a line in the sand where we say, okay, at this point, there's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle. You're saying that's not necessary, or your objection to that is that you can't impose those standards, no matter how basic and far back you're bringing it. You can't impose those standards on someone who's not consented to those standards. And my point is, and you have to tell me where I'm thinking wrong here, because in my head, your argument is also would apply exactly the same to a DRO in the scenario when they're dealing with somebody who hasn't agreed. Like I said, I'm not talking about when they're dealing with their customers. I'm talking about someone who hasn't agreed to their standards. What authority does the DRO have to impose standards on this person any more that, I don't understand how that's any different to the part 2 of the peace agreement. Either way, you're imposing a standard on somebody who hasn't consented and doesn't agree with that. They say, I don't agree with that standard. I don't agree with that interpretation. They could do that with the part 2 of the peace agreement, which is what you're objecting to. But what I'm saying is that they can do that with the DRO as well. If they're not part of that DRO, like whether you're the person being punched or the person who had his hand assaulted, what I'm saying is you go to they take you to a DRO, or you take them, or whatever, one of you goes to their DRO, but the other person isn't part of the DRO. So what I'm saying is the DRO is going to have to impose a standard on somebody who didn't consent to that standard. How's that any different to the part 2 of the piece? Do you see what I'm saying?
So if it's in the case where there's an actual NAP violation, like, a guy hitting you with their car or outright punching you, then the DRO just acts as a representative of you. Like they're not able to do anything that you're not able to do personally. So if somebody hits me with their car, I am rightfully able to exact restitution for my damages. And if I choose to have a DRO do it for me because it's maybe more civilized or more efficient or more cost effective, it makes for a more peaceful city to live in, then I can choose to do that. Or I can choose to do it myself and take on all those risks and dangers and liabilities and, maybe further personal harm, or maybe, there's risks to trying to extract restitution from somebody. Maybe you're not a professional restitution extractor, so you cause collateral damage while you're trying to get restitution. And now, they have the ability to come get restitution from you. So it would be much more messy and full of liability that way, as opposed to hiring a DRO to handle that for you. That's all it is. And the only thing that the DRO could enforce is the voluntary rules. So if the other person didn't have a DRO that didn't have some kind of cooperative working agreement with your DRO, then obviously the rules that would be applied to that person are limited to the basic non-aggression principle style rules, right? Because they've chosen to leave themselves, in a state of no societal behavioral norms that you would get from a membership in a DRO. So like if they had a membership in a DRO, maybe there would be additional rules that they agreed to that would solve the messier, more subjective situations, but they chose not to have one. So, I'm not arguing against the utility of DROs. I mean, they probably exist in what I'm proposing as well. But my point is they need to have a law above them, like the non-aggression principle. Like when you said if they're violating the non-aggression principle, then the DRO can do this. It's like, yeah, but my point is we're talking about the differing interpretations as to whether someone has violated the non-aggression principle. And that when you've got a dispute where both parties are disputing whether a non-aggression principle violation took place because of this, do you see what I'm saying? Like that's my point about the argument that you made against the part 2 of the peace agreement. And like I say, unless I'm still missing something, I don't see how that argument doesn't apply exactly the same with the DROs when they're dealing with non-aggression principle violations, where the parties are disputing whether it is a non-aggression principle violation. Because like what I'm saying is if the DRO say, well, if he violated the non-aggression principle, okay, says according to what? Do you see what I'm saying? What I'm saying is this part 2 thing is about saying, because part 1's only making the non-aggression principle the law, part 2 is defining more precisely what the non-aggression principle is, where we say this is definitely
violating the non-aggression principle, and then these other areas is where people can dispute, and that's where they would have to kind of get in their voluntary collectives and if they wanted more precise rules. But these are the lines that apply to everybody. Do you see what I'm saying? You know, like we're saying, regardless of whether you're part of a DRO, someone's not allowed to just murder you. Okay, that's nice and black and white. That's nice and simple. That's you know, that's nice and obvious. But then there's another scenario, like the handshaking guy that likes to punch people, is where, like I say, if someone came up to me and done that and punched me in the face, as far as I'm concerned, they violated the non-aggression principle, because I didn't violate the non-aggression principle. Because
you would be wrong. I can prove it mathematically.
Go on then.
You touch their property without their consent. And they are the only one that can. They are the only one that can determine if they consented to you touching their property or not. And it's that simple. It really is. Like, you cannot add anything to that equation without adding subjectivity.
But I'm saying that, as far as I'm concerned, they did consent. They did. They like what I'm saying.
You don't get to tell them if they consent. That's not how consent works.
Well, no. Obviously, if they say, but what I'm saying is if they've said something that sounds like it's consenting, like if they said, "I consent to this," because they speak a language where the words "I consent to this" actually mean "go away and leave me alone."
Right.
I know it sounds ridiculous, but what I'm saying is at some point you have to have that thing. At some point you have to have that line where you say, well, you know, because people will stretch these interpretations to absurdity. They'll exploit them if they can. And what I'm saying is the guy. I know it seems like an absurd example of someone that's going around punching people.
This is why we develop moral philosophy. This is why we want DROs. There's a demand for DROs because disputes happen. People are retarded sometimes. People are violent sometimes. We are going to have disputes, and there's only two ways to handle a dispute. You can punch it out like you do in a state of nature, or you can try and resolve it based on some kind of rational rule set that you agree to. It is necessarily something that you agree to, because if the other person doesn't agree to it, they will just continue punching you until either they win or you win. Like, that's the only two systems there are. So, like, if they choose to punch it out, there's no amount of appeals to wanting to resolve the dispute that will help you. They are in a state of nature, you are not. Or let me say that. Okay. Yeah, you are in a state of trying to apply rationality and apply what makes us human to a dispute, rather than them who are applying what makes them an animal to resolve the dispute. That's all it is. You have two choices.
Yeah, I do get that bit, but my point is when it comes to differing interpretations of what is and isn't a violation of the non-aggression principle, like with the Hans example. What I'm saying is if we can't impose a standard through this part 2 of the peace agreement, then how can we impose a standard through a DRO? And like I say, just to clarify, I'm talking about when we're dealing with people who haven't agreed to the standards of the DRO. What I'm saying is because my issue is you seem to be saying that the problem with this peace agreement part 2 thing is imposing on people an interpretation of the non-aggression principle that they might not agree with, and they haven't consented to your interpretation, so you can't impose that on them. But what I'm saying is that exact same problem occurs when you're dealing with someone on a DRO who's not themselves part of a DRO. You're going to have to impose your version of, say it's the other way around. Like I was doing it with the guy who's doing the punching as being the one without a DRO. Say the guy who got punched because he made the mistake of shaking someone's hand because he thought they were inviting him to do so. And say that the other person's got a DRO and he's saying, okay, well, you violated the non-aggression principle. And they're saying they didn't. What I'm saying is I'm proposing that we have a peace agreement that has a specific part that draws a line to kind of get these disputes ahead of time on a universal scale. It will still need DROs to deal with higher minutiae and higher standards and what have you. And I do agree with you that it would be expedient for people to be involved with such things. And so that would be the motivation there. But my problem is your argument against part 2 of the peace agreement, I'm still not seeing how that doesn't apply exactly the same if a DRO imposes their interpretation. They say you violated the non-aggression principle when you punched that person in the mouth. because he touched your hand, and you're saying, no, I didn't. He violated the non-aggression principle when he touched the hand without my consent. They're saying, you're consenting. You're having this dispute, basically. You don't agree with the DRO. What I'm saying is so what right does the DRO have to impose on you? At a certain point, they obviously must have, because if it's something really blatant and black and white, like you rape someone, then there's no question. But what I'm saying is there's definitely not a violation of the non-aggression principle over here. Sorry, go on.
No, I just want to jump in here because you said something important. I want to hook onto it because it might help forward the discussion.
Yeah.
When you said, what right do they have? Rights don't exist. Rights are nothing more than mutual reciprocal agreements between people. So if you're not participating in a mutual reciprocal agreement, you don't have rights, because the only thing they are is concepts in people's heads that govern their behavior towards others. And you hope to live amongst people that respect your rights and will afford you that reciprocal agreement. And so if we can eliminate the DRO from the discussion entirely. What right would I have to go and extract restitution from you if you're claiming that you don't owe me anything or that you didn't damage me or violate the NAP? Hell, let's even go one step lower than that. The NAP is just a concept. And so if we want to just return to a state of nature, okay, we're in a state of nature. Now you get to hit me over the head with a club and take what you want from me if you can get away with it. And if I can get away with it, I'll do the same. Do we want to live like that? No. So we try and find other people to live near that will elevate themselves out of that morass and agree to some standards. Agree being the operative word. If someone doesn't agree to the NAP itself, it doesn't matter what kind of society you formed around it. They don't agree to the NAP. That means they're exempt from its protection necessarily. Like it would be pathological altruism to continue affording somebody the protection of the non-aggression principle if they didn't afford it to you. That's all it is.
Yeah, but that's applying to the black and white. That's people that do agree with the NAP and people that don't agree with the NAP. And yeah, but what I'm saying is, what about when you've got two people that agree on the NAP but have slightly different interpretations over what constitutes a NAP violation? I'm saying that needs to be resolved on a universal level, and like obviously presenting this part to this peace agreement as the way to do that. You're saying, I'm obviously trying to steelman your position here, so correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying that can't happen because you're imposing an interpretation on somebody who hasn't, without their consent. And my point is that is also what a DRO would do. Now, to come to your question of like saying, well, when I said about what rights they have, and you said, well, rights are just a concept. What right do we have to enforce the non-aggression principle at all? It's like, well, if you accept self-ownership, the right of self-ownership, and I obviously understand there is an if to that, but if you accept that, then the non-aggression principle is self-evident morality, because obviously you've already established the right that you own yourself, so the wrong in violating that right is kind of already established by that right, if that makes sense. So what I'm saying is our right to enforce the non-aggression principle comes from the fact that we have right over only ourselves, and enforcing the non-aggression principle is by definition an act of defense. You're not imposing on somebody, you're not initiating aggression against them. It's literally defined that way. So we don't have a problem with the black and white issue of can you enforce the non-aggression principle, unless you want to completely reject the idea of self-ownership, which I think pretty much crumbles the very concept of morality itself. Then you would have to obviously accept that people would have the right to enforce the non-aggression principle, because it is by definition a defensive act. But that's all very well and good with the black and white. This is a non-aggression principle, this is not. I'm talking about when we get to those realms where people have these differing interpretations over exactly where you draw the line on what crosses what is a non-aggression principle and violation and what's not. Obvious stuff like rape's easy to deal with. Less obvious stuff like physical contact, like how we communicate consent, like proportionate response, things like that are issues that need to be dealt with on a universal level. And if we can't have a peace agreement that's kind of drawing a lines in the sand to say, okay, at this point, it's just simply not reasonable to say that that's a violation. On this point, it is. If we can't have that because then you're imposing a standard on somebody, then I'm saying, well, then the DROs are going to have their hands tied in exactly the same way because they can't impose. Yeah, it's all fine with the people that have agreed to their standards, and it's probably fine with real black and white non-aggression principle stuff. But what I'm saying is we need a way to define what is real black and white non-aggression principle stuff and what is not real black and white stuff, because the black and white is the only part that we can, use force to impose on people. So,
let's take the applications of the NAP that don't involve subjectivity and leave it at that. And if you want to expand that into a new area, well, we need to actually prove how it's an objective thing, not built on or not including any subjectivity. I'm with you. And I'm also with you saying that we need more than that can only be achieved by using subjectivity. All I'm saying is it's got to be agreed on. Even the NAP has to be agreed on. Like if somebody punches me and you both people are saying we are going to live by the NAP, and let's say one person punches me and I say, oh, you violated my NAP. And he's like, oh, no, I didn't. I didn't think that was a violation of the NAP. I thought I was, saying hello. That's how I shake hands. We're both abiding by the NAP, but we have different interpretations. Now we have a dispute. Well, what are we going to do? Are we going to resolve the dispute using some, rational, civilized process? Or are we going to devolve into a state of nature and start punching each other? Like, we have a choice. Whether the DROs exist or not, we still have the choice. It's just how reality functions. Like, we can either be civilized go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to because I think you're kind of making, in my head, you're making my argument a little bit for me, because the problem is if you allow people to stretch their interpretations in the way that you just described. If I
allow people, what does that mean? You said if I allow people to stretch their interpretations. What do you mean allow people? What does that mean?
Well, what I'm saying is like the example that you just gave of someone punching you in the face and saying, oh, I don't see that as violating the non-aggression principle. What I'm saying is if we say that the differing interpretations of what is and isn't a violation of the non-aggression principle, if we put no limit on that, then the non-aggression principle becomes meaningless, because people can just go around punching each other and raping each other and just saying, I didn't know that was a violation, or I don't agree. That's do you see what I'm saying? What I'm saying is there's got to be a line where people can't just say, I didn't think that was a violation of the non-aggression principle, because then you're not working on the non-aggression principle. If people are going to start punching each other in the face and say that's not a violation of the non-aggression principle, that is not a reasonable interpretation of the non-aggression principle. And
I agree, it's not a reasonable interpretation. But look, there are people in the I don't know if you're familiar with the United States political party, but there's a party called the Libertarian Party, and there are a lot of libertarians in that party that vote for shit like Bill Weld and like insane normie statists that are in the Libertarian Party, thinking that they're a good libertarian, thinking that they are in line with the non-aggression principle. They just reason their way into a bunch of stupid stuff. So like we can be philosophers and we can try and reason out and apply logic to the non-aggression principle, but most people are never going to do that. Most people are going to either, agree with what the experts tell them is the right interpretation, or they're going to go with what feels the best. And that's just going to be the state of the world. Like, until everyone becomes philosopher sovereigns. I almost said philosopher kings, but that's not quite the right word. So like philosopher sovereigns, until everybody has that, which will never happen, you're going to have to spell things out.
Yeah, but that's kind of what I want to do with the establishing the non-aggression principle as law. And that's why I want to draw these lines that define what's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle. We're invoking reasonable standards, but the point is if we put no limit on differing interpretations to the point where, like I'm talking about examples, but like you gave a real example of someone literally just punching you in the face. There's no possible way, really. I mean, there is possible ways, because people can say all sorts of absurd things, and your example of the Libertarian Party is a good example of that. But I think But in fact, that's a good example. The problem is without putting any limits to it, the non-aggression principle becomes meaningless. If we allow interpretations of it to be so fluid, do you see what I'm saying? Like, we can't allow reality to be
I don't know what you mean by
fluid.
allow. Like, I don't allow libertarians to call themselves libertarians when they're not, but they don't really care what I think.
Well,
I don't allow that.
When I say allow, I mean, like, if we establish the non-aggression principle as law through a peace agreement, and people say, well,
so everybody that signs the agreement agrees, then we're fine. You can make it say whatever you want.
Yeah, but we're making it law through an agreement. So the agreement part, but the law part means it's applying to people that, not just people that haven't agreed. We're applying it to everybody. What I'm saying is the rapist doesn't need to be part of our club for us to enforce the law against him. Do you see what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is
hold on. None of that stuff is needed to use force against a rapist. Like, none of this. The peace agreement. None of it. If somebody rapes, you can just attack them. Like,
well, yeah, I understand. I'm not saying we don't need this for that commission.
Yeah.
No, but what I'm saying is obviously I understand that. But what I'm saying is the law is about setting, or like having an agreed upon standard where we say this is when you can use violence. Like, this is the whole idea of making the non-aggression principle law, is that's when you can use violence, is when you violate the non-aggression principle. Because laws are threat of force, the only justified law is the non-aggression principle, because that's the only justified use of force based on self-ownership. So what I'm saying is... A simplified
way of saying that is the only time you can use violence is when somebody uses violence.
Okay, yeah, okay, but whether we call it violating the non-aggression principle, whether we call it violence, it doesn't change the fact that we still need that. And it doesn't change the fact that we need to draw a line at some point. It might seem obscure when we're talking about the guy who's, shaking hands and punching people in the face, because we're both making arguments, obviously, as one's technically touched the other person without their consent. And I do separate without from against, because it's not against their consent if they haven't expressed their consent, but it is without their consent. And I agree, you can't touch people without their consent. But I do also think that there is such a thing as reasonable interpretations with regards to what constitutes consent. And if someone says to you, Patrick, I consent to you touching my hand, in a language that actually means something totally different, then it's reasonable for you to take that as consent. What I'm saying is if we if we say the non-aggression principle is the law, but we're not going to set any limit on how people interpret things, to the point that it's not just things like making scenario. It's also the example you gave of someone literally just punching you in the face and saying, hey, that's how we say hi. That's not assault in my, kind of way of thinking or whatever. My point is if we're not going to define the non-aggression principle to the sort of degree where we have a limit to how people can interpret it differently, then the non-aggression principle loses all meaning. We have to define our terms, and we have to have some kind of line drawn. I mean, one example, and I'll just give this very quickly, this is like to get my frame of mind of what I'm thinking here. The example I always give when I talk about this peace agreement is the analogy of the desert and the grassland. And I talk about, like, say the desert represents what's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle, and the grassland represents just, not. Okay, so in the desert, you've got your rape, your murder, your theft, and all the rest of it. And in the grasslands, you've got all of this. My point is there is a kind of in-between area where one becomes the other that's harder to define. And I'm saying that part 2 wouldn't touch that area with a barge pole. It would just say, look, if we can't say for certain it's a non-aggression principle violation, then we can't enforce it. But to use the desert grassland analogy, what we're saying is when you get to a point where there's only sand around you, you're definitely in the desert. If you initiate aggression against somebody, if you punch them in the face or something nicely obvious like that, then you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle. So the limit of tolerance that we draw would separate that from something that definitely isn't violating the non-aggression principle. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's always going to be a point where you're going to have to impose your interpretation. You're not going to be able to get away with that, because otherwise, if people if you allow someone to be so fluid with aggression principle to the point that they're just going to say anything is or isn't a violation of the non-aggression principle, then there's no point in the principle. It's nothing. It's lost all its meaning. The non-aggression principle is a specific principle. We can't just apply any interpretations to it. And although I do think there is a fuzzy edge where reasonable people can debate certain scenarios, because there's potential arguments in both directions. I'm not saying there's not an objective right answer, but just saying that it's perhaps harder to see because, to use the desert grassland analogy, you're in the desert really, but you did see a bit of dead grass over there or something. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that. It's a little bit like that. It's a little bit like, with the handshaking thing, you can say, well, look, it is physical contact uninvited, but the other person's thought it was invited. And, and this is where we go. So I don't know how well I've articulated my explanation, but that's my basic point. You've got to define the non-aggression principle, and you've got to have a limit to the differing interpretations that people want to apply to it. It is a specific principle, and it's built on the concept of self-ownership. You have right over yourself, and that is the only right you have. So we know on a black and white level that you can't violate somebody else's right, but there are areas where people say, well, I wasn't violating his right. I just said hello to him, or I wasn't violating his right. He violated his right when he touched me, and that's why I punched him in the face. And I didn't, or, you see what I'm saying? Sorry, I did there.
There are valid interpretations of the NAP and there are invalid interpretations of the NAP, and both will always exist, and neither have to be cared about. That's kind of my point in the state of nature. Like the whole point of finding and joining a collective would be to garner the benefits of living amongst people that reciprocate the rights that you want reciprocated. Like if you were into doorbell bombs and handshake punching, you would not want to live in my collective. You would want to live in the doorbell bomb handshake punching collective. And that's just a state of nature thing. And if you chose to live in my collective and still install doorbell bombs and punch people for handshaking, and maybe don't participate in the DRO system, obviously, because that wouldn't support you, then you are back to the state of nature. The whole point of a collective is to get out of the state of nature. And if you're going to live in a collective and then at the same time return to the state of nature, then yeah, you might get clapped. ... End of episode.
Okay, but it's like you said, valid.
We're kind of going around in a bit of a circle.
Can I just say one more quick thing? Because I just want to quickly. Where you said valid interpretations and non-valid interpretations of the NAP, I suppose from my point of view, I'm saying part 2 is about separating one from the other. It's about separating valid interpretations of the NAP with non-valid interpretations of the NAP. And I'm saying that at some point you have to impose that. Whether it's and that, so that's what I'm saying. It's like, sorry, I didn't want to cut in, but when you said that kind of rung a bell in how best to explain it, where you said there are valid interpretations of the NAP and there are non-valid interpretations. I'm saying yes, and that's why we need this line to separate one from the other.
But that's number 1, not number 2. Number 2 seemed to be like more subjective, like weird stuff, including like handshakes and stuff.
Well, no, because part 1's just agreeing to the principle. So part 1 is saying, I agree that the non-aggression principle should be the law. Part 2 is where we draw the line that separates a non-valid interpretation of the non-aggression principle from a valid interpretation of the non-aggression principle. Does that make... I know...
Yes, and my only point about number 2 was that even if the only thing on number 2's list is thou shalt not murder, you still have to get people to agree to it. Otherwise, it is spiritual. It doesn't, it doesn't exist in reality. The only power it has, whether it has one rule that says don't murder, or it has 1,000 rules, including proper handshake traditions, you still have to get people to agree to it. And if somebody doesn't agree to it and still lives in that area, then they might get clapped. I'm going to the might get clapped philosophy right now.
But you don't know. You don't need permission from a murderer to enforce the law against murder, do you? For that.
In or out of a society, you don't need permission to do anything. Do you want to live in a society like literally, we exist in nature and we can do whatever we want physically. And we have this giant incentive to elevate ourselves out of the state of nature for our own self-preservation, because it gives us a longer, more peaceful life and being more secure in our property if we live in societies that respect the rights. And so let's design a society that respects the rights as much as possible, and just realize that, like, the people that agree to it are, you know, like I want to walk up to somebody and be like, hey, are you a good person? Yeah, here's my membership card in the society. I'm being overt on purpose. And, you know, if I go up to somebody else and I'm like, hey, you know, they list something for sale on Craigslist, and I go to their house and I'm like, oh, you want to sell me your lawnmower? Can I see your membership card? Or, you know, well, I'm being overt again, but, you know, like, and they don't have one, I'd be like, oh, okay, well, I'm sorry, I can't trust you. Or, you know, if I do business with you, my DRO won't cover the transaction, you know, because you don't have, you know what I mean? Like, all it is trust. So if they don't have a DRO and I still buy their lawnmower and it turns out they defrauded me, I go to their house and I whip their ass, and that is still NAP compliant, like, because they defrauded me, whatever. Now, if they want to elevate themselves out of a state of nature, then they would have a DRO that would handle that dispute, you know, for them, and we get along better. We want better. Most people want better. Even statists want better, right? That's why they cling to government, because without government, who will provide a justice system? Because they want that. They want a justice system, rightfully so.
But there is a distinction between what you agree with somebody and, like, I mean, this is my thinking of it, but the whole point of the right of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle is to separate that from things that we would just agree within ourselves. Like, you know, it's not a violation of the non-aggression principle for you to wear shoes in your house. But if I invite you into my house and say, is, you know, part of the agreement for you to take your shoes off, that's part of an agreement, but that's not the same as saying, if you come over to my house, you've got to agree not to murder or rape anybody. It's like, okay, well, that's also part of an agreement, but there's a difference between the two things, because the taking your shoes off when you enter a home rule is only something that I can impose with your agreement. The don't rape or murder thing is something I can impose regardless of your agreement, because by definition, it's just an act of defense. Do you see what I mean? So I separate the non-aggression principle from just agreements. For me, the point of making the non-aggression principle the law is we're saying this is the one thing that you can use force with anybody over. You know, this is when you're allowed to use force. It doesn't matter whether they've agreed beforehand or whatever. Well, that's the point of the non-aggression principle. It's saying this is the moral use of force, and you know, and this is not. So, you know, like the agreement, I mean, I think when we spoke about rights, and one of the reasons why our conversation was like 5 hours long is because we do seem to have a fundamental disagreement on what rights specifically are, because you kind of see them as like a contractual agreement. And for me, they're similar. I understand where you're coming from, because if someone violates that, you know, if they don't have right to the rights they don't respect and deny, you know, and they deny to others. So I see where you're coming from on that. But the problem is for me, your right to not be raped, murdered, assaulted, or whatever, that is because you have right of self-ownership. That's not because we've come to some agreement not to murder and rape each other. You're not allowed to do that anyway. But if we've come to some agreement where I provide you bread and you provide me milk and we've made some arrangement, that's not something we've forced on each other without our consent. That's an agreement we've made with consent. Do you see what I mean? I'm trying to separate your obligation to provide me with milk because you consented to that obligation, and your obligation not to murder or rape me because regardless of whether you consent, that's a violation of a fundamental right that I want to protect with this law. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, let me try one more way. And then if nothing else, we'll put this on pause. So if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? If the nap is violated and no one is around that gives a shit about the nap, what difference does it make? Does anybody even know or care if the nap is violated? So the nap being important requires a lot of humans understanding it and implementing it and choosing to make it important. And without the people in your group ascribing to it, then it's immaterial. It's a tree falling in the forest with no one listening. And so we want to live in collectives where people do that, because the nap is special. Like, I feel like I've been on the wrong side of this the whole time. The nap is very special. It's like one of the only rules that has ever been discovered that can be universalized and solve a whole lot of problems very quickly. And without going too far into the things you already know, people could reciprocate any rule, any random rule. It could be a right that I provide you tea and crumpets on a Tuesday. And, some asshole is going to get that wrong and think I meant days starting in T instead of Tuesday. And now we're going to have a dispute. Like, it's just like, we need dispute resolution. We need rules in place. The only requirement of somebody that understands the nap and respects voluntarism is that it just has to be consented to. People have to agree to follow this stuff. And if they don't agree, fine, they're in a state of nature and they don't get protections. That's all I'm saying. Like, which is kind of effectively the same thing that you're saying. It's like if you choose to not be in the nap society, well, okay, then they don't have to care about your rights either. That's all you're doing. When you say that you're not going to be part of the non-aggression principle group of people that respect that, all you're saying is you're not going to respect rights, so you have given up the onus to have your rights respected. That's it. That's all I'm saying. Like, that's it. I just don't think you need any fancy philosophical justification to get there, because it's just reciprocal behavior. That's all.
Yeah, I do disagree that it is just reciprocal behavior, because, like I say, if it is, then it doesn't separate our agreement for me to deliver milk to you from your obligation not to murder or rape me. You know what I mean? It's like, what I'm saying is your right to yourself, the rights that the non-aggression principle basically represents, is not. This is perhaps a fundamental disagreement we have about rights, because that's not part of it is reciprocal in the sense of, if you violate, then you lose your right. I understand that side of it, reciprocal. But what I mean is like, I only have to give you eggs or milk if we make that agreement. But regardless of what agreement we've made, even if we've never met, even if we've never come in contact before, I'm not allowed to murder, rape, rob, and assault you.
Says who?
That's kind of says the concept of the non-aggression. Says the concept of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle.
Concepts can't talk.
So
who says it?
Me.
There we go. We're done. All right. Thanks.
No, but what I'm saying is if you accept self-ownership, all right, okay, if we want to go behind that and say, well, why do we have to accept self-ownership? But what I'm saying is if you accept self-ownership, then any violation of the non-aggression principle is wrong in accordance to that right of self-ownership that you've already accepted. Okay. But what I'm saying is your right to self-ownership is, it's what we call like a natural right in regards to the fact that it's I'm trying to think how best to word this, but do you see what I'm saying about how I don't like in how you're describing it? How is the obligation to deliver milk?
You broke up. Can you say that? Can you start that sentence over? Sorry, you broke up. Can you say that again? You broke up a little bit.
Sorry. Sorry. How is the difference between, like, for me, the difference between me delivering milk to you because we've made that agreement, and the difference between me not murdering you, regardless of whether we've made the agreement, is the fact that agreement is required for the first thing, it's not required for the second thing. Like, we don't have to come to some sort of agreement where I don't murder you. I'm just not allowed to murder you. That's like I say, that's why I want to say, that's why it's about, is enforcing it as law. That's something that can be enforced on people without their agreement. But you only have to deliver me milk if you agree to deliver me milk. Do you know what I mean? Like, you have to accept that obligation. You don't have to accept, well, you don't have to accept, but
if I want to be safe from being murdered, I have to accept the obligation to not murder.
Yes, but what I'm saying is if your right to not be murdered doesn't depend on the agreement of your potential murderer. That's what I'm saying. So, like, your right to have milk from me depends on whether or not I agree to deliver you milk. Your right to not be murdered by me does not depend on my agreement to not murder you. You have that right anyway. Does that make more sense now? Or what I'm saying, at least, whether you agree?
I mean, it's the difference between a positive and negative obligation, but you can kind of make the same case both ways. If your entire life, every day I brought you milk and every day you handed me a cup of sugar, and then one day I stopped handing you milk, you would not feel the need to continue handing me a cup of sugar. And so if every day I didn't murder you, and then one day I tried to murder you, you would stop feeling the need to not try and murder me back. Like it's just an agreement.
Yeah,
I'm not saying it's not an important agreement. It's kind of important, right? And the beauty of the nap, the special thing about the nap is that of all the agreements that we can make between one another, the nap is like I would almost say objectively the best.
Well, it's universal. I mean, that's one thing that we both do agree on, that it's the only principle that you can apply universally. But my point is your right to have milk. You don't have a right to milk as a standard thing. You don't have a natural right for me to deliver you milk. But if you make an agreement with me for me to deliver you milk, then you obviously do have that right. And I have that obligation to provide you milk because I entered into it, because I entered into that agreement. But my point is even without that agreement, I don't have to deliver you milk. I'm not obliged to deliver you milk. But I am obliged not to murder you, regardless of agreement. That's my problem with your conception of rights, is it doesn't seem to separate the obligation to deliver you milk from the obligation not to murder you. One, in my mind, in what I'm saying, is one requires agreement and one doesn't. Whereas you seem to be saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that both require agreement in the sense of my obligation not to murder you only comes if I accept that obligation. But I'm saying, no, I've got that obligation anyway.
I think that one is an easy obligation to maintain because it's a negative obligation, so you just don't do the thing. And the other is a positive obligation. I think that's the difference. Like, it's easy for me to maintain a reciprocal negative obligation to not murder people by simply really trying not to murder people. So,
but how easy it is doesn't affect the principle.
Now, when you say when you say absent an agreement with somebody, like let's say you and I had never met, and you're saying I have an obligation not to murder you. Okay, says who?
Well, I'm basing that on the right of self-ownership. So I'm saying, because I believe in the right of self-ownership and that everyone has right over only themselves, you don't have the right to murder me. So you are obligated not to murder me. You, like you say, it is only negative obligations, and I take that point. But what I'm saying is it's still an obligation, even a negative one. It's still an obligation that you haven't. I'm saying that you're obliged to leave me alone because you don't have any right over me. So you're obliged to leave me alone. But you're not obliged to provide me with milk because there's no principle, there's no fundamental principle underneath it that says that you have to give me milk. You'd only have to give me milk if you agree to give me milk.
Yeah,
Do you know what I'm saying?
Let's say I'm an asshole and I don't know or understand any of that fancy philosophy talk you just gave me about fundamental rights and humanity and natural rights and blah, blah, blah. I don't understand it. I don't care. So who says I have an obligation now? Because I don't get any of that. I don't believe in any of that.
Well, that's my point. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it. It doesn't matter whether you believe in it. That's the point of it, separating it from the milk example. Your obligation to provide milk is dependent on your agreement. It's dependent on your...
None of these things have to be written down for them to be understood. I think that's where Patrick is trying to set. 1 + 1 will always equal 2 even if you don't write it down.
All right. Thank you, Zeku, for the $10. He said, just to reiterate, none of these things have to be written down for them to be understood. I think that's where Patrick is trying to set. 1 + 1 will always equal 2 if you don't write it down. Yeah, so please continue what you're saying. Let me just set it up again. So I was saying, like, if I don't agree or understand or care or whatever about any of that natural law gobbledygook you just said, and of course I'm playing ignorant because I do and whatever, and I love those ideas. They're important to me, right? But let's just say I don't give a shit and I don't understand and I don't care. Nothing obligates me. Like, an obligation is either it has to be something that I agree to. Like, it's got to be a concept in my head that causes me to desire to behave in a way, either by taking or not taking action. Like, an obligation is just an idea in my head that controls my behavior. And so if I don't have your fancy philosophy gobbledygook in my head, who obligates me? And the only thing you can respond to is to say that you obligate me, and you obligate me by threat of violence if I choose to take those actions, which is fine.
Well, no, I would disagree with that a little bit, because I would say that I would say the principle obligates you. So there is a slight. I understand the point you're making, but there is a difference, because it's not just that I'm obligating you, because I could obligate you to, if I had the force, I could obligate you to deliver me milk. But what I'm saying is there's no principle underneath it that says that you're obligated to. It's just me being a tyrant and using force and threatening you and demanding you give me milk.
And most people don't care about principles. I think we agree on that.
Well, yeah, I understand that, but my point is, it doesn't matter if a rapist cares about the law against rape. He's still not allowed to do it. There's still an obligation for him to leave people alone. Whether he accepts or agrees with that obligation or cares about it doesn't matter, because, again, come back. This is the point of making it the law, and this is.
Hold on, and likewise, if the thief or murderer doesn't care about the nap, it doesn't matter. You're still going to attack him. So if the thief or the murderer still doesn't subscribe to your Nations of Sanity project, it doesn't matter. You're still going to apply force to him. So but we're talking about the morality of it. We're talking about the principle. So, like, it doesn't matter if I did something like, it doesn't matter if I enforced a non-aggression principle against him or used force to stop him from murdering me or whatever. It also doesn't matter if I initiated force against him and murdered him for no reason, in the sense of what principles and stuff. What I do, and if it's, what matters in that context is whether someone can stop me. So I understand that, like, these principles aren't magic things that make things happen. We still obviously have to enforce them and what have you. My point is the only consistent, like, the only moral justification, and I'm pretty sure you wouldn't disagree with this, but, like, the only logically consistent and morally consistent use of force is defensive force. Like you can build that on a principle that's universal and consistent, that you can only use force to defend yourself. You can build that on the concept that you have right over only yourself, and to protect that right, you can use force, and to violate that right, you're not allowed to violate that right. So what I'm saying is you've got that principle that sets that kind of standard for not what you can and can't do in a physical level, because a rapist can still rape in the sense of physically being capable of doing it. But what I'm talking about is whether he can from a moral point of view. And what I'm saying is if we're going to have morality at all, then the only universal morality that we can have is the non-aggression principle. I'm pretty sure you agree with that. You said it yourself in not so many words. But yeah, I don't disagree with anything you just said. Yeah. But my point is because of that basic truth, then we can enforce that as a law, something that we obligate everybody. We're imposing that obligation on everybody. I know it's a negative obligation, but it's still an obligation. You're still obliged to leave me alone based on that right, not because I said so, but because of this basic right says so. Do you see what I'm saying? So, and I don't disagree. But the only time I disagree is when you come up with subjective interpretations that aren't that fundamental defensive use of force, the fundamental reciprocity of force, like calling the handshake puncher the bad guy when he was responding defensively. Like, if you want to have a rule, fine, do that. I would want to live in a place that had that rule too, but don't also say that you're doing that based on some kind of fundamental philosophy.
Well, I mean, the reason why I say that is because, and this is the problem, because we've got this, even though we're very close with how we define the NAP, there's these tiny little differences. I mean, I think threats are a violation of the non-aggression principle as well. So that's another area where we disagree.
Why don't we let's capstone the previous, why don't we do that? Because we've been going 2 hours and 15 minutes. Zekamaru says, donated $5.
Why does it have to be written down if it doesn't matter anyway?
Why does it have to be written down if it doesn't matter anyway? Because most people don't care enough to figure it out, and it helps if you... Because most people follow. Most people are followers, and it helps the people... Because most people aren't going to become philosopher sovereigns and figure this shit out. So, like, you know, the people that are interested and do want to figure this stuff out are providing a service, which other people would hopefully subscribe to. This came up recently in another conversation. Oh, man, who said it? Somebody sent me a video, and it was David Freeman. Yeah, he was talking about how, like, competing societies would be like a more practical rather than deontological approach. I think Phobe sent me this video, but it was basically talking about how this, rather than having these like philosophers deciding from top down deontologically how everything is going to work, you're going to have these competing societies with various legal systems. And my counterpoint to that was to say that the thing that would diverge these societies into competing groups would be the philosophers arguing for the different interpretations of the stuff. And so it's kind of a mix of both, but both are true. You're going to have different people preaching, I'm using religious words on purpose because you're literally just convincing people of things. You're going to have different groups of people. You're going to have like the Christopher Cantwell community, God help us, that preaches some insane stuff that, you know, most people would probably not have reciprocated agreements with. And you're probably going to have the Molyneux collective, and you're going to have, you know, because he's gained a large following, you know, something like that. I'm just giving you examples. And so it's actually going to be, unlike, counter to what David Friedman says, it's not the societies that are going to be competing. It's the philosophers that are kind of arguing for those individual differences in their societies that are competing with each other. It's like the ideas are the ones competing, less so than the societies. Obviously, practically, it's the societies, but... anyway, so the last thing, did you have anything you wanted to say on that? And then I want to kind of put an end cap on it for now, whether or not we agree. And then, you know, if we want to spend maybe 20 more minutes, we can talk about the subjectivity of threats, and then end the show probably about that time.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if it's the same video that I saw of David Freeman, but it kind of ties in a little bit with what I'm saying, because there's a video I saw of him where he was talking about an ANCAP society that he envisaged, and he was talking about drug laws, and he was basically saying about how it wouldn't be expedient for, you know, people to enforce drug laws against each other. And my concern with his rhetoric in this particular area, and this is where I sort of diverge from some ANCAPs, is my point is it doesn't matter how expedient it is. You don't have a right to enforce drug laws on people. You do have a right to enforce rape laws against people. You know what you see what I'm saying? So my problem with David Friedman,
to your conception of rights, right?
Well, according to the non-aggression principle and self-ownership, I mean, that's just not my conception. I mean, there's no possible interpretation of self-ownership that would allow for drug laws. Rules, yeah, but not laws that you enforce on anybody. Where you see what I'm saying? What I'm saying is, if you accept the concept of self-ownership, then you can say that people aren't allowed to rape, murder, assault, and all the rest of it. But that same concept also says that you can't stop people from using drugs. You can't stop people from gambling. You can't stop people from selling their bodies for sex or whatever voluntary interaction they want to do. You know, it's not me saying this. There's a print underneath this. It's not as subjective as I'm saying, well, I don't think people should be allowed to rape. I think people should be allowed to do what drugs they do. This isn't me saying, well, it is me saying it, but you know what I mean? What I'm saying is I'm not just saying it arbitrarily. I'm saying it, this is what this principle says. If you believe in self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, and if you want a free, the problem is that if David Freeman's idea of an anarcho-capitalist society is a society where drug laws in theory could exist, but probably won't because they wouldn't be expedient and effective or whatever. My problem is that's not a free society. If someone can use force against you and violate your self-ownership, that's not a free society. And it's not a whole lot different to what we've got right now with regards to people using violence to interfere with your right to do what you want with your own body. I mean, all of this does depend on accepting the self-ownership. But my point is once you've done that, once you're at that point, then what you can use force against and what you can't use force, what you have a right to do and what you don't have a right to do, for the most part, is pretty self-evident. And I mean, I don't know if you agree with me on the point there with regards to David Freeman's anarcho-capitalist society, but for me, that's not a free society. And I don't see the point in such a society where people have the right to use violence against each other to violate their self-ownership.
Well, consensual violence is not a violation of self-ownership, right?
Consensual violence isn't. No, I'm not. I'm talking about drug laws. I'm not talking about rules. I'm not talking about saying, hey, if you want to be part of our group, you've got to agree to not do drugs. I'm talking about drug laws. I'm talking about.
So you're saying David Freeman was talking about drug laws and not drug agreements?
Yeah, I mean, unless I don't,
That's
I don't want to
surprising.
strawman him in any way. I'll link you to the video. I'll link you to the video, and I don't want to strawman him in any way. But I watched the video about 5 times over because I was kind of in disbelief at what I was hearing.
I will be in disbelief as well. Yeah, please link me.
I will send you the video, but and tell me if because obviously I don't want to misrepresent him if that's not what he was saying. But like I say, I've watched it over and over, and he was saying that the reason why drug laws wouldn't exist in an anarcho-capitalist society would be because it just wouldn't be expedient to spend your time and resources stopping other people from what drugs they take. And the first thing I was thinking was, it doesn't matter how expedient it is, you're not allowed to. You should, it's not, you don't have a right to. And this is kind of my whole thing about, I think a free society needs to be defined and created with the NAP as the one rule that defines it, because if you don't have that, then you don't have a free society. And then it starts becoming a hell of a lot like the status society that we do have, where people can basically, because then it becomes might makes right. Then it becomes, well, if it's worth
the absence of ethics. Yeah.
Exactly. It's, if we're in a society where, because the thing is, it's all very well him saying it wouldn't be expedient for somebody to enforce drug laws. Well, it depends where their priorities are. If it was very important for them that other people didn't do drugs because of whatever reason, they might decide to put. My point is it doesn't matter how expedient it is. They don't have the right to do it. And this is my thing about separating the non-aggression principle from other things and separating what we can enforce as law against anybody, regardless of, what they've agreed to beforehand, and separating that from contractual agreements, like I say, going back to the milk delivery thing. You're only obligated to deliver me milk if you agree to, but you're obligated to not interfere with my self-ownership based on the concept of self-ownership.
So let's end that with a comment from Jim Jesus, who follows David Freeman a lot closer than I do. Okay. He says that he thinks David was talking about polycentric law, not a monocentric state law. So I would link us that video in the Discord. I know Jim's in our Discord, and we can all kind of take a look at that later. And for those that are watching, let me throw this up there real quick. A couple things, actually, in this brief intermission before we close out with a discussion of threats and the non-aggression principle. Excuse me. There's a link to our Discord server at the top of the screen right now. Disenthrall.me/platforms. You can follow us across all of our platforms, as well as find the donation links. And at the top is the Super Chats link that will allow you to do the Super Chats without giving YouTube a 30% cut. And I wanted to call that out especially for EG because he's been our biggest donor through Super Chats by far over the past several months. I wanted to make sure that you're aware when you do the Super Chat through YouTube, YouTube and Google literally take $30 every time you do that. They take 30% off the top of those super chats. And I would be surprised if that was what you wanted to happen with your money. So if you want me to get all of the donation, or at least mostly all of the donation, the link at the top of the screen, streamlabs.com/disenthrallme. If you donate through there, you can still get your message on the stream in exactly the same way as YouTube. It's just I think I get all of it, if not, like, maybe I lose 1% or something like that instead of 30%, which I'm ready to turn off super chats because I'm tired of making Google $100 a month in super chat fees. Like, Google does not deserve that. All they do is harass me and take down my channel videos and anyway, so I'm not going to go on a rant right there, but I just wanted to make sure you knew the Streamlabs link at the top of the screen. If you guys want to if somebody wants to test it right now, actually, I don't think I've ever gotten one through the Streamlabs because I don't pimp it enough, but maybe drop a couple bucks on the Streamlab link and we'll see if that even works. Okay, so thanks for that brief commercial. Let's do 20 more minutes, and let's make it kind of a hard stop at 20 minutes. But let me quickly make the case for this position I have on threats not being part of the non-aggression principle. And let me again preface this by saying I am not happy with this position. There's a couple positions that I'm currently at right now, one of which is the lack of the existence of free will, and the second one is that I can't find a way to make a universalizable objective definition of a threat that would allow me to plug it into the non-aggression principle in the elegant way that we're able to plug so many other things into it. So we have to define what is a threat. And the best definition that I've really found so far is a threat is a communication of a future violation of the non-aggression principle contingent on some kind of action, usually. Not always contingent, but usually contingent on, I'm going to do this to you if you don't blah. Now, I guess it could just be, I'm going to do this to you, and it might not have an if statement on it, and that would still be a threat. But the most common threat is, a communication, and I'm picking these words semi-carefully, a communication of a future NAP violation, conditionally or otherwise. I guess that part doesn't really matter. Now, the problem is not any of the words that I just said beyond communication. Because communication is necessarily and hopelessly subjective. And communication could be anything from telling somebody verbally in a language that they understand, I'm going to punch you. It could be yelling at you in a foreign language, but doing so very angrily and like violently angrily so. It could be pointing a gun at you. That is a communication of a threat. The pointing of a gun communicates something to you. But even that communication is subjective. So, and I'll give you an example of that because I think most people would have normally disagreed with what I just said. If I point a gun at you, that is still a subjective communication of a threat. And the example I use is a long time ago. It's kind of a funny story. I don't know if you remember that Pokemon game on mobile where people will walk around sort of like heads down, with their phone, looking for Pokemon in the real world. It's like an augmented reality app or whatever. And they'll just kind of blindly walk around. Well, I used to, in my last company, I was sitting in my office and a friend of mine would just kind of heads down sort of like wander into my office hunting for Pokemon, and it would just like distract me briefly, and I'd be like, dude, what the fuck are you doing? Get out of my office with that Pokemon shit. What's wrong with you? And it's all in good fun or whatever, but I remember this one time when I was like, okay, I'm gonna do something funny. We're going to have him, I'm going to take a picture, and it's going to be him wandered into my office hunting Pokemon, and I'm going to be behind him, and it's going to be a picture of me with my pistol pointed at the back of his head, and the caption will be, "Ha, I'm hunting Pokemon hunters." And that was the gag. It was like a gag meme kind of thing, like they're hunting Pokemon, I'm hunting them, whatever. If somebody had walked into my office in that moment with no conception of the joke that was happening or anything that we were doing and saw me pointing a gun at the back of my friend's head, they could have, and probably maybe even reasonably so, would have confirmed or concluded, it worked.
First.
It worked! Dude, you're the first! Comedy Philosophy has attested our Streamlabs. I'm assuming Comedy Philosophy is someone that I know, but if it isn't, dude, thank you for the donation and thank you for testing Streamlabs. That makes me happy. So if somebody walked into that room in that moment, they could have, a frontal, it was you, dude, thank you very much, I appreciate it. They could have reasonably, using your reasonable word, maybe concluded that I was threatening him and could have responded with defensive force on his behalf against my threat. So you could make a case that they could have shot me for doing a perfectly consensual gag with my friend. I'm just trying to build the case for the most clear-cut example of a threat. Pointing a gun at somebody is still subjective. And then, so that's just to draw the clear-cut side. Now I can draw the wildly unclear side, which would be, if somebody from the Amazon walked up and you know, maybe you were yelling at somebody or you were pointing a gun at them, they've never seen a gun. They have no idea what that is. They have no conception that a gun being pointed at somebody is a threat. If a species from outer space comes down, they have no conception of what a gun is, what language is, what the cultural norms are. They have no way of interpreting what a threat is, because a threat is necessarily based on cultural norms, societal norms in the area. Whoa! Did you see that? He did like a GIF. I forgot. Streamlabs, you can like do your own GIFs on Streamlabs that like overlay on my stream. That's cool. I've never seen that before. Thank you, Zachary, for the $3. I have ascended. Insert evil laugh for test donation. Dude, thank you very much. Anyway, so on both ends, you can kind of see even somebody that has experience with the cultural norms of the area could misinterpret the gun example, and somebody without the cultural norms that are subjective have no framework of interpreting what is and is not a threat in any kind of objective or universalizable way. I hate this conclusion, but what it means is that you can't include it in the non-aggression principle because it lacks that universalizability and that objectivity.
Okay, there is a problem I see with that logic, though.
Oh, good. Like, I'll be happy to be wrong on this one.
Well, I mean, the problem is, and this comes back to my comment earlier where I said I think that you actually go too high resolution with things with regards to finding the subjectivity of it, because I agree with what you're saying to a point. But the thing is if we take the point that communication is subjective, which is why we can't enforce threats, then how do we establish consent? Because surely communicating consent is the exact same problem as communicating a threat.
That's why dispute resolution is part of elevating ourselves out of the state of nature. So if I communicate consent to you by holding out my hand, well, that's a pretty flimsy communication. If I'm buying a house from you, I might want a stronger confirmation or a more concrete confirmation of your consent, like a 50-page signed real estate contract. That, you know, is notarized and witnessed by somebody. And, you know, there's all these extra steps we go. The more important the thing is, the more we want to make sure that we have proof of consent. And I would say that, like, if consent was objective, like, it wouldn't be necessary because it would be easily identified. It's because it's subjective that some things require a lot more effort.
Well, I'm not making the case that it's objective. What I'm saying is it's only subjective, or to see it on a subjective level, to see the subjectivity of it. Again, this is why I say I think you actually zoom in too much, because almost everything becomes subjective. And like I say, that the problem is by saying that there's no way that we can communicate a threat, because it'll always be subjective, would create the exact same problem with communicating consent. And you can say, oh, well, we'll do it in a more definitive way. So, well, okay, well, what if someone threatens in a more definitive way? The point is still the same. What I'm saying is, if you're going to say that if you're going to say that the threat thing is unenforceably subjective, because we can't invoke more reasonable standards and all the rest of it, my problem is That's all well and good, but if you do that, then you create the exact same problem with expressing consent, and then it kind of creates a knock-along problem. This is why I think that you actually go too high resolution with it, because I think that because I'm not disputing what you're saying. Like, you can argue a certain level of subjectivity to anything, but this is why I say we have to invoke reasonable standards. Because if I come up to you and speak to you in English, and express my consent in clear words, you could still say it's subjective, because how do you know that I wasn't speaking a totally different language that just coincidentally uses similar words that mean something different and all of that? But so what I'm saying is so I take your point, but the problem is with the point you're making is that it defeats other things in regards to, like I say, if we can't have threats because it's too subjective, then we can't have consent because it's too subjective. And then how do we communicate anything? You know what I mean? This is why I do insist, I know you hated me keep saying the reasonable standards thing, but that's why I kind of stand firm on it, because I say, if you go high resolution enough, if you go deep enough, then you can always find a subjective angle. You can always, I remember having a conversation with somebody, and this isn't what you're doing, but just to give you an idea of the problem of how subjectivity can infect anything, is I remember speaking to somebody literally about the definition between subjective and objective, because he wasn't quite sure what I was talking about. And I said, well, look, if I say that car's pretty, then I've made a subjective claim, because that's an opinion. But if I say that car is red, and then I've made an objective claim, I've made a factual claim. He turned around and said, everything's subjective, life's subjective, reality's subjective. And the problem with him saying that was, if you go on a deep philosophical analysis, okay, well, go on.
No, I was just saying I disagree. That's not my position. So I don't know that. Okay. I don't know.
I'm not saying this is your position.
I feel like you're trying to hand wave me away by saying I'm too high resolution, which sounds like a compliment, but you're not really dealing with or rebutting what I'm saying. So like, I either have a valid criticism or a valid position, or I don't, and calling it names like high res doesn't address it.
Well, no, I'm not trying to call it names. I'm not sort of waving it away either. Yeah, no, but what I'm not waving it away. I didn't mean it in that regards. What I'm saying is that you can, like, this is why I say that there needs to be that kind of subjective standard. If I say that car is red, and someone says, well, that's subjective. Actually, it's not red. It's something else, or there's no such thing as colours, or or whatever kind of level of analysis. I'm not saying that you are doing this. I'm just saying that the problem is you can kind of make everything subjective, and then you lose the distinction between objective and subjective if everything is subjective. So when I say about like you going too high res, what I'm saying is the problem that you create. I'm just using the same rationale, or at least this is what I think I'm doing. Correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I'm just saying that if we use the same rationale that you're using for saying that we cannot include threats in the non-aggression principle because it's too subjective, and you can't communicate a threat in a way that is 100% objective, my point is you have the exact same problem with consent, and you can't not have consent with the non-aggression principle, because that's part of what makes up the non-aggression principle. Like that's what defines a consent. Consent is a big part of the non-aggression principle. So we can't wave away consent or the fact that or people communicating it. At some point, we're going to have to say, okay, to a certain standard, this person is, even if we set the bar really high and say they've got to be really explicit, that we've still got to accept a certain standard where we're saying they've communicated consent to a reasonable standard. I'm bringing that word back, but this is where I think it applies.
So we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to say one thing, and then I want to give you the last word for better or worse, or win or lose. I trust you. So I would just say that, like, the difference in the nap and consent from the nap to the threat is that consent doesn't have to be communicated. Consent is internal. It's your internal state. If somebody does something to you that you don't consent to, you don't have to tell them that you don't consent for it to be a nap violation. Your internal decision of consent is what makes it or breaks it as far as the nap the nap goes. The other thing I wanted to say, Phobes said something in the comments and then I'll give you bonus time because I know I'm talking longer than I expected. Phobes said that and correct me if I got you wrong, Phobes. Maybe we can talk about it later on Discord. Jim Jesus donated $1,
but reasonably.
Get clapped, but reasonably. Yes. The reasonable clapping. Phobes said that this discussion of the threat doesn't have anything to do with the nap, but most people's conception of the nap is that you should not threaten or initiate force, and you can respond to a threat of force with actual force. Which is how the threat thing applies to the nap. So I just wanted to clarify those two things, and I'll toss it to you for the last word, man. Go for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I that is how I define the nap. It does include threats. It doesn't, you can respond to aggression or threats of aggression. So, I mean, I think I've kind of made my point, really. That is my issue with it. I do think we can't get away from reasonable standards. I do think that was kind of demonstrated with the threats consent thing, because you still need to, all right, I know what you said about the consent being internalized with regards to from your point of view, but you still need to be able to communicate consent to have consensual activities with other people. And if you can't communicate a threat to somebody in any way that we can say that person's definitely threatening that person, then how can we communicate consent in a way where we can say, okay, this person definitely consenting to this activity and we're not raping them or whatever is the non-consensual version of the activity we're about to engage in. Do you see what I'm saying? So yeah, that's my point anyways. The reason why I stood firm with my whole reasonable standards thing is I do think at a certain point, and this is that limited tolerance, this is that line in the sand, at a certain point to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, this is where we can say for sure to a certain, like I say, to that reasonable standard thing. And if we can't have threats because they can't be communicated in any way that's 100% objective, then we're just going to have the exact same problem with consent. And then I just think that would then everything about the non-aggression principle kind of melts away, because these are the things that are part of its definition. Even if you don't think the threats are, we both agree that the consent is. So
I know I told you I was going to give you the last word, and I guess I'm going to have to give you another opportunity because I got to respond to this, and I promise it's going to be the last time. But it sounds to me like you just said that you're going to enforce your interpretations of what are reasonable standards on people that have not consented to it. And the last thing I'll say before I kick it to you to respond to that is I had what Phobes said wrong, so I apologize, Phobes. All right. So it sounds like you're going to enforce your reasonable interpretations on people that haven't consented.
No, I'm saying that the non-aggression principle can be enforced on people that haven't consented, and we have to draw a line around the definition of what that is and what a non-aggression principle violation is. We have to draw a line at some point to define it. So that's. But I would stand firm. The only one other thing I'd say, I would stand firm by saying it's not my interpretation. It is, like you say, there's valid interpretations of the non-aggression principle and there's non-valid interpretations of the non-aggression principle. And my part 2 is about separating one from the other.
Cool. Well, we did it again. We made a almost 3-hour live stream. And I enjoyed it for the most part. I always enjoy our back and forths. Hopefully next time we'll have a totally different topic, because I think we have beat the ever living shit out of this one. So again, let's go back to the beginning. I appreciate people that are trying to do the work ahead of time and design ways that societies could work once we're free of coercion. So do you want to point people towards where they can find your work?
Yeah, I've got a website, nationsofsanity.com. There's a YouTube channel, also Nations of Sanity, and a Facebook page, also Nations of Sanity. If you Google Nations of Sanity, you'll basically find me.
All right, awesome. And the last plug that I'll give is for an idea that I had. I kind of brought it up in yesterday's stream. I want to pitch it again and see if I get any commentary. I was considering doing, because I was kind of inspired by Larkin's thing. He's doing little 5 to 15 minute rants every day now, like a daily rant, and he's releasing it to people that are his $5 patrons and above. I think, maybe $5 patrons. Would you guys like something like that for me? Maybe just like really quick little daily notes about whatever randomness I'm thinking about. I'm trying to come up with ways to thank the supporters and to incentivize more supporters. So let me know if that's something that you'd be interested in. Please remember to join our Discord server. We have a lot of really kind people there, and we keep it civil, and we have a lot of great discussions and debates almost daily in there. So drop by. Matt, thanks for spending time with me. It's been great as always, and I think we'll go ahead and end the stream there, guys. Thanks for watching.